So what I'm going to do is I'm sharing my screen. And you guys have all had it. Can you all see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Yes. So the way rules are written, we start out with definitions, right? And that means for the purposes of this document, whenever you see this word, this is what it means. And this gets back to Angela's training on inexact terms, delegative terms. And so one would think that the best place to start with rulemaking is at the beginning. But if we start here, we really have no context for later, right? So what I try to do is keep this in mind, keep this next to you, and we will start going through the rules. And if you come upon a word, you don't know what it means in relation to these rules, you can go back. If you see a word that you think we should explore, again, we're going to be going a little bit slower because we're virtual. It's a little easier when you're all in the room. But raise your hand if you could help us for the sake of record, say your last name or your first name so we know who's speaking, and then say, I think maybe we need to explore this term, okay? So if we're all ready to get started, I think what we can do is we can start on section 331-960-0005, and we'll start there and we'll have like a running pin on the definitions. Okay, so if you're not sure, we'll go back. If you think we need to add something, again, I'm driving and I'm typing here with two screens. So if I don't see your hand, feel free to jump on the mic and say, I have a question. I also have staff on the line. If they have a question, they might come on or they might give me a post-it note. So I'm spinning a lot of plates. Be patient, okay? So
can everybody see
can everybody see the rules that I have shared on my screen?
They're a little bit small, but I also
okay.
have mine beside me.
No, that's okay. I can see this is what we need. We need someone to say, hey, make it bigger, because I can do that. Let's see. Let's run it up to like 125. Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic, because we're going to be doing live wordsmithing. This is exciting. So we're going to start in the fee section. Again, you know, we have to have very specific directions. So we say anyone, an applicant. This is somebody who has put in an application but not yet received a license. We use the word authorization. Let's get this out of the way, because here at the Health Licensing Office with more than 30 professions, we have licenses, certificates, registrations, you name it. So we use authorization as a umbrella term, okay? So we say that anybody who applies or has an application is subject to the provisions of, and the 331-010 are HLO rules regarding payment of fees, penalties, and charges. This is, you write us a bad check. You know, what are we going to do about it? And it's kind of all that piece. So let's open the floor on fees.
So, Anne?
Yes, is this Richard?
This is Richard.
Hi, Richard.
So, hi. If I may, I'd like to just make an editorial comment.
Sure.
And I realize based on what Angela told us that, you know, the statute is the statute and we may not necessarily be able to impact that at all. But, you know, from my perspective as an owner of a staffing agency, you know, the healthcare licensing is something that exists in other states. So like Washington, for example, has what they call the nursing pool license. And the fees for Washington State for a nursing pool license, it pretty much accomplishes the same thing that I understand this is going to accomplish. Like the initial fee is $175. The annual renewal fee is $155. There's not a fingerprint requirement, but so looking at the renewal fee of $2,000 per year just seems to be way off the charts compared to other states that have a similar type of program. So I was very curious about how these fees were established, given that other states are
Mhm.
a lot less than this.
Sure, and that's a great question. One of the many interesting things about this bill/statute when they codify it is that the Health Licensing Office has never licensed businesses before, right? We were established for licensing individuals in certain scopes of practice.
Right.
And when we establish fees, we work within the state. Usually there's an association, there's a known pool of people that are interested. In the last 9 years that I've been here, we've gotten a new program or board every year from the legislature. And we have a certain number of people with an association, and they say, we'd like to be licensed, whether it's for third-party reimbursement or access or recognition, whatever it is they want. And we have a certain number of people. We have a matrix. We look at risk. We look at how many. We look at the services we're going to have to provide for them. Do we have to create a test, an examination? Do we have to give a practical examination? Do we have to inspect facilities? Like what services they're going to have to provide? How high risk is the profession? And we look at all of that and we matrix it out and we do the math, because we don't take general funds again until this program. We have to be self-sustaining. So we look at all those factors and we say, okay, what's it going to cost to keep this program going? One of the interesting things about this is, number one, we've never done a business before. And number two, we don't know what businesses are going to come here. So who's going to show up? We don't know. And so there's so many unknowns. With that, this is what our fiscal analyst gave us for pricing. What's nice is once this gets up and going, if in the past, what HLO has been able to do, it's so much easier to reduce rates and give discounts for certain things rather than increasing rates is a much bigger ask than giving discounts. So in the past, we've been able to, once a board or a program shows itself to be sustaining and they're bringing more money in that's going out, you want to maintain a cushion, because if you have a big case that goes all the way to an ALJ or even the Oregon Supreme Court, it gets real expensive real fast. And so you want to maintain a cushion, but if programs are bringing in more money than they're spending, once they reset a cushion, the HLO has the ability to offer discounts if you meet certain conditions. And again, there's so many unknowns about this program, we don't know what the conditions might be. But this is the number that was provided to us by our fiscal experts. And again, I'm happy to take feedback, but that's sort of a broad overview of how we do things here.
Right. Well, I appreciate the explanation.
Sure. Thank you for asking the question. We have Julie has her hand up.
Yeah, just real quick, and thank you. I'm curious because the staffing agencies that support staffing in the hospitals are also required to have Joint Commission certification. And really it's a similar, they're a governing body that regulate how we provide staff to hospital systems. And that's about $4,000 initially to receive. And then I think annually it's about $2,500. I don't know where or if there is opportunity to speak to that in this process, but I think that that's something that should be considered as well for those that are already providing services to hospitals. Thank you.
I don't understand. I don't understand the question. Are you saying that you want to be exempted, or I don't understand the statement?
Well, I'm curious if that's an option for firms that are already certified through the Joint Commission, if there is opportunity to have discussion if this is an additional requirement they would need to meet. So it's almost like we're being double approved to do business in the state of Oregon, because we already have to have that to do business with hospitals. So I don't know if and when there's a right place to incorporate that. I just want to make sure that the individuals that are on this call understand that this is in addition to those requirements to do business in a hospital as a staffing firm.
Okay, yeah,
So-
that
And it's costly. Yeah.
right. I don't know anything about that world. All I know is, you know, the bill that we were given. I've got somebody, let's see, I've got Julie, I've got, oh, Barbara. Barbara, we'll go with you next.
Yes, thank you. I had a question about the physical location fee. Is that for the staffing agency, or is that for each skilled nursing facility that they would be providing care for?
That's a great question. According to the statute and the way we've read it, it is each individual location that the staffing agency has, not the location that they are providing services to.
Okay, and
So-
if the staffing agency is out of state, then they would not have to pay the physical location fee?
It's my understanding that if you've got a place where people can walk in, an office, a service center of some variety, you would brick and mortar. You would have to have an authorization for each brick and mortar location. If you are not located in the state, I can ask. I mean, I'm not in a position. That's the other thing is, if you're asking me to interpret, I don't have a law license, so I don't want to practice law without a license. So what I can do is, if there's a question, I can take the question if I don't feel I can answer it. But
Thank you, I appreciate that.
no problem.
So Ann, this is Richard again. So this particular legislation and the rules, are they intended to apply to temporary staffing agencies who provide staff to all kinds of facilities, including hospitals,
Correct.
including surgery centers, or is this strictly focused on, I'll use the broad term of long-term care field?
That's a great question. According to the statute, that a temporary staffing agency means, a business that operates in Oregon for the purpose of providing temporary work to personnel, providing healthcare services, or assisting with activities of daily living for or on behalf of entities that engage them. This includes licensed and unlicensed people.
So the activities of daily living are primarily, that definition in the industry primarily applies to, and I'm using the broad category of long-term care facilities. So, so does a hospital provide assistance with activities of daily living?
I don't know. That's what you guys are here to tell me.
Yeah, because it seems like this is focused to the broad long-term care field.
Oh, we have Sarah. Sarah, have you joined us?
Hi.
Hi, Sarah.
I'm here.
Hey.
I'm listening. Hi.
Okay.
So I'm a registered nurse, and I'm just speaking to, I think that was Richard's question. And I would say that, yes, broadly, even a hospital does provide activities of daily living to patients. And I think that that would go beyond your typical healthcare hospital, long-term care facility. And what I just heard, if that in itself might be a definition, then that also could apply to agencies who, for example, and I don't know if working in the home is outlined here, but that could also apply to agencies who only provide non-licensed staff for senior care in the home. So that might be something that, if it's not specified, we might want to question.
So you're saying it could apply to any place where a temporary staffing agency provides a temporary healthcare worker.
Or non-licensed professional who's assisting with activities in the home or elsewhere. Yep,
Yeah.
that would be my understanding.
This is Angie, the legal counsel. Just to clarify that the exceptions to it are home health agencies that are licensed and in-home care agencies that are licensed. and home care workers and personal support workers listed on the home care registry. So
Yeah, there's exemptions.
those are all exempt. So those are not a part of this.
So
You said
Just-
that are licensed.
yes,
So,
and do you have this? One of the things, please, that you should keep in front of you is Senate Bill 1549. There are exemptions listed in section 1. 2
Okay.
large letters. Okay, so let's not get down too far in the weeds on that one. Before we get too far off track on issues, do we have any more questions about fees, or can we move on? Erica, do you have a question?
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to echo that I feel like this would probably carry forward in the hospital setting, because I know when Senate Bill 1549 was originally being put in place, it was temporary staffing agencies that would suit everybody except for those exemptions. And my only thing to say, and I feel like what I tend to do is look at both sides of the coin. And while my bigger serve is how we serve the clients and the patients and keep the small businesses functioning when temporary staffing agencies aren't maybe overseen in this fashion, is that we did in the beginning of all of this want to make sure too that we weren't causing exorbitant costs for the temporary staffing agencies so that they then wouldn't be able to serve Oregon. So I'm just throwing that out there to support both sides.
Okay, and I have Robert.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, again, regarding the, or a comment regarding the licensing fees. Now, going forward, another couple sections to section 965, or division 965, number 1 says no temporary staffing agency may operate in Oregon without an authorization. But then I'm looking at this, the fee section here. So, if I want an authorization, to operate in the state of Oregon, but I'm not physically located here. My office is in Idaho or in Nebraska. Excuse me. If I'm an out-of-state provider operating in this state, do I don't have to pay the $2,000 physical location fee? That's.
Let me be clear. In order to operate in Oregon, you need to have an authorization.
Yeah, that much I get.
Bill, right. The bill or statute says that each separate location that a temporary staffing agency has in Oregon has to have its own license. So if you have a brick or mortar authorization, if you got a brick or mortar in Portland, one in Salem, and one in Eugene, each one has to have its own license, right?
But what if I don't have a brick and mortar in Oregon?
right. So I think that point, and like that's sort of interesting there that he's making, that kind of makes sense to me, is that so the way that it's written right now, it says authorization for each physical location is $2,000 valid for one licensure year. I think the interesting thing about that is I can see how you look at that and you think, oh, wait, does that mean I don't need it then? Because it says physical location. So it might be something we want to look at in the language of the rule to make sure that what we're saying is that authorization required for, for operation in Oregon or something around those lines of basically authorization fee is $2,000. An authorization fee is required for you need at least one, and then you got to have one for each additional physical location. So something to clarify that rule so it's clear that you got to have one, and then each additional physical location. So yeah, something around those lines.
Okay.
Got it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm kind of getting at. Yeah. Okay.
So I think, Angela, to your point on the definitions, you have to have authorization to operate as a temporary staffing agency in the state. And that's the definition number 1.
Right.
And so to operate in the state, one has to pay the fee.
Right.
Then if there's additional physical locations, then there's a fee for every physical location.
Perfect.
Which, talking about fiscal impact, if agency has 6 locations within the state of Oregon, that can get pretty expensive.
Well, keep that in mind. We've got a whole section to do the fiscal impact.
Okay.
So let's keep that, put a pin in that. Okay, and let's see, who else? Robert, you have your hand up? Robert, are you on mute?
Yeah, I'm just trying to bring my hand down here.
Oh, okay, so you're covered. Shell, did you have a comment?
Well, I think it sort of got covered in that, but I was just going to say that I was questioning why it would be 2,000 per physical location. Does it add that much cost to what the how does physical location add cost to what the agency you folks are going to need to do to administrate this was one of my thoughts, because it seems awfully expensive if it's the same exact business with all the same people, just a different location. And the other thing was whether or not this has been benchmarked against the costs of other states, not just the advice of somebody who, professional or not, decided on the rate. Because what was described there about Washington, which is true, is that this is more than 3 times the cost of Washington, and it would be interesting to know how did they come up with that number, and are they going to benchmark that or measure that against states that have licenses to see, are we way out of line, or are we just
Right. No, that's a great point, Shell. One of the things, every state's different, right? Every state has its own way of doing things, its own way of funding programs. Some states subsidize, some states, every state has its own flavor. Nevada has control issues. Arizona has trust issues. We kind of looked, our statute bill is uniquely itself. It was very hard to find anything that was like it. The closest thing was Minnesota, and their license fees are $2,000. But we really try, we have to unfortunately look to our own house and say, what is this program going to cost to operate? Because we have staff that we have to get, and that's really how these things are priced out, is what are the vagaries of the bill? What are the expenses associated with running this program? And part of, again, I mentioned it, and, I'll say it again, is just how new and different this is to HLO. Like I said, we have 18 boards and programs, and this is very, very unusual and different for us. So we have to price it on an awful lot of guessing. So that's, like I said, once this thing gets up and running, and when we get to the fiscal impact, we can talk about this more because we get a lot more ground to cover. We have to kind of do an awful lot of guesswork with this program, and we have to make sure that it doesn't, it's self-sustaining. And until we know how many operators are going to be here and what the intricacies and the pitfalls of it are, if it's all swimming and great and there's no problem, we might be able to offer a discount. And we've done that before. But out of the box, this is what the fiscal analyst came up with. Oh, and our interim director, Bob Bothwell, would like to comment, please.
Hi, can everybody hear me? I'm talking across the room, trying to avoid feedback, having my laptop on. One of the factors that were taken into account was the number of identifiable temporary staffing agencies with current registration with the Secretary of State was used to help the fiscal analyst determine approximately how many temporary staffing agencies we would have in the state. So, and as Annie mentioned earlier, this is what was come up with, and then later on, if it's determined that there's $2,000 is too much to charge to keep the program running, it's a lot easier for us to give a discounted fee rather than try to go to legislation and get a fee increase. So, and we did take into account Minnesota, which was the closest to what this bill reads out. That's all I just wanted to add, that we went on Secretary of State's website.
Okay, thanks, Bob. So are we ready to move on? Obviously, some of these comments will come up again at the, we're gonna have a very specific section for fiscal impact, bring all of this, and for the racial equity statement. So again, keep all that, make notes. So one of the things that, again, administrative fee, in case anybody has a question, if you're late, if you don't renew on time, we will charge you $500 per year of inactive status if you don't renew on time. You can be inactive for 3 years and get current. After 3 years, you have to reapply and meet whatever requirements are in place at the time. The administrative fee, again, is if you write us a bad check, and you'd be amazed how often that happens. The next rule is very, very simple. If you have any thoughts on it, it's just meeting the requirements of 1549. We have a database called Elite that we enter our authorization holders into. People can search by name, they can search by county. What's interesting is if you don't have an Oregon address, we'll have to work on that. But does anybody have any questions about just how we're going to be offering this information up to the public? No? Okay. So because, again, we have businesses that are going to be coming from other states, there are things that we put in this set of draft rules that we don't put anywhere else. It's very unusual to repeat a statute in rule because what's the point? It's already there. But because we have folks coming from other states, we thought we'd offer up as much information as possible so they don't have to then go bouncing all around the wide world of statutes. So we listed the exemptions. You're not a temporary staffing agency if you, and here are the exemptions that are listed in statute that we spoke about earlier. Any questions? No? Okay. So we're going to get to Division 965, which is the qualifications for getting an authorization, the application process, and the renewal process. Okay, so as we mentioned it before, and was brought up by our group, no temporary staffing agency may operate in Oregon without an authorization. You must obtain a separate authorization for each physical location. You must register. These are, again, draft rules. I'm not seeing any hands yet. You have to register with the Oregon Secretary of State Corporate Division to conduct business. Again, we're making sure that you're checking all the boxes to do business in Oregon. Little c, is straight out of 1549, making sure that all the personnel that they're sending out meet any professional authorization requirements established for the practice or performance of the service provided by the personnel. That simply means, in government speak, that if you're sending out an RN, they need to be authorized as an RN. Does this make sense to everybody? Not seeing a lot of hands. You guys are keeping up. We have, again, assigned personnel to settings for which the personnel have appropriate work experience. That you're not sending, the apples out to do an orange's job. That they're appropriate. And obviously I have X's in E because I haven't listed the rule yet for the records retention, but the statute also requires retaining records for at least 10 years. And that's their request or demand out of their statute. And what I was wondering is when you talk about records, as temporary staffing agencies, what kind of records do you keep and what is the normal retention period for retaining records of who you hire, where you sent them? What does that world look like?
Well, this is Richard Evans. We use a staffing program, and I'm sure a lot of the other agencies do too, where we retain our records for actually indefinitely. So even, if somebody's active, then they're in our active status. If they terminate their employment, go somewhere else, we still have record of them and all of their credentials. So
Okay.
we already have that process in place, and we can go back to when we first started our company in 1998. So
Okay, so a little bit about, and we'll get more into it later, but we're complaint driven. So if folks have, anybody has a complaint about the services or a situation with an authorization holder, they would fill out a complaint form. We are statutorily required to open a case. And we have subpoena power. We can get records. We do interviews. We have a whole investigative section of our office. And this might be something they ask for. And according to our RAC, this wouldn't be a problem, that you keep records and that would be available upon request. Is that correct?
Correct.
Great. Any other comments from anybody? Any questions?
I have one quick question
And who
about,
speaks, please?
I'm so sorry, this is Sarah Spanger.
Thank you, Sarah. Please.
You bet. On B, assigning personnel to settings for which the appropriate work experience, right above, who determines what appropriate work experience is? An example I would give is maybe our agency has a requirement that an RN must have 2 years of experience to be employed in a contract position, but another agency says they only need 6 months. Who is right and who is wrong? Is that so? The Joint Commission example earlier is basically that we have to develop our own policies around how we qualify experience, and then we have to follow them. So is that to each individual agency to show that they're following their own policies to determine appropriate work experience?
That's a terrific question. Usually with something like this, if we got, we can't decide what's right for you, but what we can do, and we've done this with other boards, is if we got a complaint and say, you were sending a CNA out to do an RN's job, or you sent somebody to a surgical center who wasn't appropriately trained and we got a complaint. What we would do is look at, how do you determine what is appropriate? Is the person have any registration? Are they trained to work in a surgery center? And then that would all come out as part of the investigation process. And so what's nice about appropriate work experience is, with rules, you want it to be specific enough so people know how to stay on the right side of and that's the other thing. Rules are the floor for public safety, not the ceiling. Right? What is the bare minimum that you have to do? And so what we would do is see, okay, who did you send out and where, and what were the requirements, the generally accepted, standards for that type of work? Were they ready to be there? And then we would make the decision. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
That's part of the investigative. I keep forgetting that you guys don't live in our world. You have to keep slowing us down so we can answer these things. Does anybody have any more questions? Man, you guys are great. Okay. So we're going to, with no questions, we're going to move on to the application requirements. So again, we talk about the initial authorizations are subject to the provisions of, and these are the sections, Division 30, again, issuance of a license. We have statutory requirements regarding identification, what forms of ID that we accept. If you need a duplicate, you need a copy. Erica, your video's breaking up. You might want to consider turning your camera off. I'm not sure what's going on there. What sort of IDs that we'll accept. If you need a copy, what the process for that is. We've got statutes that cover all of that. In order to get an authorization, you would have to complete an application form. We're working on that now. One of the things that the 1549 requests that is new to us is the names and addresses of this application's officers, directors, and any other person that has ownership, partnership, or similar interest in the staffing agency. Can any of you speak to that similar interest, ownership, partnership? Are there any other business components or players that we've missed in that description? No? Okay.
Well, so I do have a question. It
Yeah,
may or
this
may
is
not.
Richard, right?
Yes, this is Richard. It doesn't apply to us directly, but it's very possible that there would be staffing agencies who may be publicly traded.
Mhm.
And so if there's shareholders in that and there's numerous shareholders, is that a similar interest?
That's a great question. It's my understanding that when this was written, it was the majority shareholders, the ownerships, the partnerships, the big players. If they're publicly traded, I mean, this is something I'm going to have to ask about, but he wrote this, it seemed like it was just, you know, the main people. When you go to the Secretary of State, it'll list the key players. And I believe that's what they were getting at with this.
Okay.
Can any of the staffing agency owners speak to this? Or managers?
I had the same question. This is Julie Tate. I was wondering that as well, because there are agencies out there that also have silent partners and investors. And so, you know, defining that, I think, is going to be really critical to make sure that nobody is accidentally not doing what they are supposed to do by this new rule.
Yeah,
I think,
this is Richard. It just seems like it's overly broad.
Okay.
And I don't really understand why it would need to be that broad. You know, because we all have to be licensed in the state of Oregon. So that's just my take on it. It seems overly broad.
And so this is right from the statute, and then the majority of those terms are part of, you know, the sort of corporate world, you know, statutes that already exist. And so the similar interest kind of is just more broad. And I think that in an application, how that sorts itself out is in the physical application itself. How HLO, you know, puts in the physical application what you want filled out in that part.
Right.
That's how
And
that
then,
gets.
you know, when it comes to the fingerprinting, you know, it's like, okay, so if that definition covers 200 people and only 5 of them have any actual working in the state of Oregon, it just seems unnecessary to me.
Help me understand unnecessary. Are you talking about unnecessary to add them to the application?
Well, so depending on how many there are, you know, if you've got a nationwide organization and they have an office in the state of Oregon, so who would be subject to this particular section of the requirement? Is it anybody that has a similar interest in it? And then if any who has a interest, would they be subject to the fingerprint requirements? I don't know, that it just seemed to me as being overly broad.
It is broad. It's really broad, and that's why we need you folks, because right from the bill, it says ownership, partnership, or similar interest. And anyone who's listed on the application has to go through the fingerprint process, and for the initial authorization, and every 2 years as a condition of renewal per the bill. So
and that the fingerprint is a whole separate discussion, I think.
well, we're if we can explore anybody who has any more feedback on the officers, directors, or any other person that has ownership, partnership, and similar interests, because that is straight out of the bill. Again, some of those terms are defined in the corporate world and the corporate statutes, but really it's going to come down to the business and how they fill out the application. Sarah, what do you have to say?
Well, all I was going to share is just from going through some other state either applications or renewals recently. And of course, I can't seem to find an example They were pretty specific in terms of, and maybe this is spelled out in some of those other statutes that you just mentioned, but they're pretty specific in terms of, for example, like the owners or the people within the corporation or company that need to be fingerprinted must have greater than 10% ownership. Please state, what their role is, what their ownership level is. And so it was very specific so that you knew what information needed to be included both in the application and also who needed to be fingerprinted and have background checks.
Okay.
Okay. That's certainly something food for thought, for sure. And this whole section we were really hoping to get lots of feedback on, because again, with Big B, copies of the applicant's organizational documents, articles of incorporation, other relevant filings. What might fall under relevant filings?
Yeah. So this is Richard again. So copies of the organization documents. I'm speaking from a company that operates in the state of Oregon and is filed in the state of Oregon, and we have no problem providing that, but all of that information is available from the Secretary of State. But so we would be having to provide that when that information is already on record with the state of Oregon.
Right. Well, we need fresh information. Per our bill, when you apply, you have to provide fresh information, because we've worked with the Secretary of State, and that is not, it's a one-time, not really living document. It's just a moment in time. And we've seen an awful lot of information that is redacted, that's out of date. And one of the things with applications, even if you're going to apply for a driver's license, you don't get to go in and say, oh yeah, well, you have all my address stuff, just ask the power company. When you apply, you have to provide the documents that our statute requires, our bill requires you to provide to us. And also, when you sign that application, you're signing that that's all true. And we don't have the staff to go out and pick and choose, go looking for things. You provide us what we need to have, and you're signing that that is all accurate.
Right.
Because
I totally understand that.
Great.
And I'm in agreement with it.
Terrific. Great. Well, I love the feedback. So again, you'll have to prove that you are registered with the Oregon Secretary of State, because it's important that you are, checking all the boxes, to operate in Oregon. And again, we get to the ownership, partnership, or similar interest, passing a fingerprint-based national criminal records check pursuant to. Now, the 331030004 is our whole rule regarding how fingerprint checks work. Life scan, they have the digital, it goes through, Oregon State Police, and, it has that whole world captured in that rule. Other states, have similar background checks and things like that. Any questions about the background check process that is required by the bill?
So this is Richard again. So on the fingerprints, it's initial for everybody, and then it's every 2 years?
Upon renewal, yes.
Okay,
that's
and
correct.
is there a very good reason why the same person would need to be fingerprinted every 2 years?
Well, first of all, the bill requires it.
Okay.
And and again, a fingerprint is, and this is just some context that I'm bringing up from our other boards that require, a lot of boards require initial fingerprints. That's a national background check. And then they require, say, a state, because up to this point, all of our players have been in the state. Then they require a LEDS check, which is the law enforcement data system, to make sure they have to attest on their renewal if they've been arrested for a felony or convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony. And when we check that, we make sure that they are being truthful to us, because some of our licenses have a condition of renewal. You know, again, you can't, you know, we have to make sure we get the bad actors. So we have Erica. What is your statement?
Oh, I was just going to echo what you just said, because just like a driver's license, you can have a crime that then would impact you from possibly not being approved for authorization. And so it's common practice to do fingerprints every 2 years.
It's a fingerprint, and that's why it's interesting. We have fingerprints even have expiration dates, like yogurt, you know, because get those fingerprints done and you walk out and you cause a fatal crash. Well, 5 minutes ago you were okay, and now you're not. So that's part of the cyclical piece of it.
Okay.
If there are any more, number 3 is, if we don't understand something, if we need additional information, you might be asked to submit something extra. Again, we're kind of building these things open-ended because this is a strange new world for us. We don't know what we don't know. You know, so we might have to make adjustments to rules going on because we don't know where the potholes in this road are. So again, that's where you guys come in. We do have, in order to get your authorization, you have to pay all your fees. And number 5 is a new thing for us. We have individuals who apply for licenses and then have to take exams that maybe they don't pass the first time, or maybe they only pass part of the practical exam the first time. And so we have paperwork on hold for a while. We thought with businesses and, you know, your capacity to get your paperwork together, we thought if you start an application and it's not finished we thought 90 days was a reasonable amount of time. We're going to say it's incomplete and that application is going to be closed out. Application fees are non-refundable because we've already done some work on it. How does 90 days sound to everyone? Do you think it's possible to get everything together within 90 days?
What is the delay potential for fingerprinting? That would be my only concern. Is I don't know what that even looks like. So is it, you know, open to the public to be able to go in quickly and do it, or, you know, I just don't know. So that would be my concern.
You know, and again, I love this group. You ask the best questions. One of the things that we encourage folks is to kind of have everything together and then do your fingerprints. There are, I mean, obviously LifeScan, they're digital. They're a lot quicker now than they used to be with slap prints with ink, and then they'd have to be read. Now they're digital. If they're done well, they have to be funneled through the state police. Now, or, you know, the law enforcement of your choice, whoever's doing it, wherever you are, because again, we don't know where you are. Sometimes the police departments have backups. We had a backlog during COVID at the state police had a real problem, and sometimes that happens. Tina, can you, again, I don't know coming from other states what this is going to look like, but with the digital system, it's a lot smoother. Tina, do you have anything to add? Tina is our licensing manager, and she is the process guru. So do you have anything to add to this conversation?
Well, I can say that during COVID, there was a backlog of fingerprints, but they were probably, the furthest backlog was 30 to 40 days. I would suggest anybody applying, make sure that each and every one of your individuals that you're going to have to fingerprint do go in and get those promptly done, so it's not going to hold up the application process, because that is one of the main things that we do have problems with our other application, is the holdup of somebody waiting longer than somebody else to go in to get their fingerprints done. So I would just suggest everybody do it all at the same time or within days of each other, so it won't hold up your process. But right now they're coming in pretty fast.
So this is Richard again. Sorry don't mean to monopolize it. So on the fingerprints in the long-term care field, people go, I just forgot the name of the place they go, but there are locations all around, and they can go in and get them done for $12.50, and they're electronically taken and electronically submitted. Is
Yes.
that the same type of thing?
Yeah, it's called field print.
Yeah, that's
it's the digital fingerprints. You don't have to go in and get your hands all messy anymore, and they transmit them electronically.
So if we go do that, it costs like $12.50, I think. So if we do that, then do we still have to pay the $50 fee for fingerprints?
Actually, yes. Bob Bothwell has our interim director. I'm sorry, Tina, I didn't mean to speak over you.
No, it's okay.
He and Tina have discussed this. So Bob.
So if everybody can hear me. So LiveScan is at Field Print Office is a great tool, but keep in mind that it's not infallible, and it takes more time for us to be notified that the fingerprint might not have been a good capture than a good capture. So if you give yourself some leeway time, just in the event that your fingerprints aren't very well taken for whatever reason, that we get our notification, and that can take a week or better. And then with regards to the fee, that's what the applicant pays at the LiveScan or Field Print office where they go. And then the office gets billed the amount, $50, for each fingerprint that the Oregon State Police runs through LEDS and NCIC.
Yeah.
Thus the fee for the fingerprints.
Okay. So again, get your fingerprints done and get everything together, and that within 90 days we should be able to get everything together. So if that's reasonable, everybody thinks that's reasonable, we can move on. Any more questions?
It's Richard again. I'm sorry.
That's okay, Richard. You're here for a reason.
So are we supposed to go to field print or not? And if not, then do we
Yes.
go to
Bob has an answer for you, Richard.
okay.
Richard, this is Bob again. If you actually just Google field print, you'll be able to locate a field print office or a third-party distributor, if you will, for in your area to have it done. And they are nationwide.
Right. Okay, so we can use field print.
Oh yeah, it's any place that does the digital fingerprinting. I've heard it called LiveScan. I've heard it called field print. It could be a lot of different things, but it's essentially criminal records quality digital fingerprints.
Yeah.
Less messy. It's great. And also, I used to work for state police, so the ink slap prints were a lot harder to get a read on than digital. So they do go much quicker.
Okay.
Bob, do you have anything else to add on fingerprinting? Okay.
Thank you.
So, of course, thank you. You bring all the questions. Okay, so again, some of this language that we're going to move on to in 96510 is very boilerplate to the health licensing office, which is your licensure year. Some states, I understand it's probably going to be confusing. Some states have all their licenses for their program come due at the same time. Well, when we have, tens of thousands of licensees, that really doesn't work. So what we do is we say that your authorization, your license will become not current. We have current, which is you're active, you're in good standing, current or active. We have not current, which means you haven't paid your renewal on time. And then we use the word expired. And expired means you have been inactive for 3 years. Okay? If you are inactive, you can pay your late fee and become current. Once you are expired, you have to reapply and meet any of the current requirements. So we let people know that your authorization will become not current on the last day of the month, 1 year from the date of issuance. Okay, so you have the whole month. It's not like you have June 12th to June 12th. You have the end of June. Okay. Just number 2 is pretty much what I just told you. You know, if you're inactive, your authorization is not current. You cannot operate in Oregon. If you have been inactive for more than 3 years, you are expired and you cannot renew. You must reapply. You must keep your authorization on file, and if the office calls, you know, needs to look at it or someone needs to look at it, you have to make it available upon request. Any questions about that section? That's just kind of the basic overview of what an authorization is and how it works. Okay. Ready? All right. Notification requirements. One of the things that's important when you have an authorization, anybody who operates in healthcare knows this, you have to let us know if you've got any changes. You can't open a new place, you know, take on a new, you know, owner and not let us know, because we need to know who you are and what you're doing and where you're operating. So if you have a change in any of the officers, directors, or any of those folks who are on the application, you have to tell us within 30 days. We've got change of information forms that will be available on our website. If your physical location in Oregon is an office building and you move down the hallway, you got to let us know. Any new people that are added, owners, officers, they, along with the change of information, you need to make sure that we get the fingerprints done and they pay the $50 fingerprint fee, because we're changing, you know, the players on that particular authorization. Any questions? Concerns? Okay. We're doing really well, by the way, time-wise. So renewal. Again, we reference back to our OARs regarding the renewal of a license, Division 30. Again, we're going to, you know, that has to do with how you would write us, you know, give us money, identification requirements, any of that kind of furniture. You have to send in a renewal application form. Any additional information that we might need as part of the renewal. Again, changes to names or addresses of the officers, directors, persons with ownership. Changes in organizational structure. You know, if you take on a new partner, if, I don't know, again, I don't know what I don't know. You take on another component, you have to let us know about that. Again, it's just part of letting us know who's holding this authorization. Pay all your fees. Again, if you're in inactive status, you can't operate here. And every 2 years after the issuance of your authorization, you have to have everybody, all the key players, redo their fingerprints. One of the things we did add, number 5, was background checks, submit those 60 days before the authorization becomes not current. Because once your authorization becomes not current, you can't operate, right? So we're trying to build in that buffer. Get those fingerprints in before because once you're on the deadline, once you know, at midnight and your authorization expires, you can't operate. And since fingerprints are kind of the unknown, you know, we have staff, they turn applications over, they're professionals, is what they do, but sometimes fingerprints can go slow. Anybody who's had them done knows you can have bottlenecks, you can have slowdowns, you can have, as Bob mentioned, a bad image, and you have to go in and have them redone. That's why we built this in. Get those fingerprints, any changes, any fingerprints to us 60 days before you become not current, to spare you the agony of our license expires tonight, and what do we do? So we tried to kind of build, it looks like a requirement, but really it's sort of a a shock absorber for our authorization holders. Does that make sense? Y'all doing okay? Wow, you guys are great. Okay.
And Anne, this is
Yes.
Tina.
Thank you.
Did you
Tina.
mention then there's a late fee?
Yes, as I
Okay.
mentioned before, if you go into inactive status, we can get you current, but it's $500 per year for each year of inactive status. Once you hit 3 years, you are expired and must reapply. Again, that's a policy, and according to our statutes across all of our boards and programs, is that you may not be able to offer services, but you don't have to automatically reapply. You can get current if your license or your authorization lapses. Does that make sense to everybody? Great. Again, we go on to 970, professional authorization requirements. You have to essentially say when a client is seeking personnel, you know, some businesses, whether it's a long-term care facility or surgical center, is looking for personnel for a position. Temporary staffing agencies must make sure that the personnel are certified, credentialed in any way that is appropriate for that setting. That they're obviously the credentials are in good standing, and that if you know that one of your personnel, maybe they're an RN that's licenses lapsed or something that's going on, that you have, it says here that the authorization holder will terminate the personnel and notify the client entity of the termination. Any thoughts on that, Erica? Erica, I believe you're on mute.
Sorry. Mine is just for the next statement under the 970-0005. I wanted to make a possible addition.
Okay, perfect. Okay, we'll put a tiny pin in that. Anything with 970 quad 0? No? Okay, so work experience. Erica, what do you got?
Yeah, so for this one, again, I remember the beginning of Senate Bill 1549 and a lot of the reasonings behind it. And so the area that I wanted to add is where it says every authorization holder must ensure that any personnel placed with a client entity has the appropriate work experience, training, and then I wanted to add trainings, competency and background, because competency is just a big key word in pretty much all rules right now. You can have training, but if they can't even be competent in it, that makes it really difficult.
Okay.
This is Julie. Would that be evidenced by like the skills assessment that we administer to our staff upon hire? That's how I would see it, but how do we define that?
I think from the other side, that could be a part of it, and then the way it would be defined is in your policy. But I do know that not all agencies are consistent in doing that skills assessment.
Got it. Yeah, I could see how that would be a concern for sure.
Okay, so let me offer this. When we get into words like good standing, competency, that puts us into those inexact terms that were mentioned earlier. When you say the word competency, people are going to have different pictures in their minds. Like, what does that mean? So other boards we've had have said something to the effect of, well, we're not going to tell you what competent, one of them was the use of restraints with behavior analysis. And they said, our board said, we're not going to tell you what your policy should be regarding the use of restraints, just that you have a policy.
Agreed.
Even if the policy is we don't use them. And that policy, if there's an investigation, we could say, okay, were you following your policy? So with that in mind, does that get us any closer to the concept of competency?
I would agree with that.
So
This is Erica.
How would we
Sorry.
express that, Erica? Barbara, your thoughts?
I feel that the position that the nurse is taking would, or the temporary staff member, could possibly be in different settings. And it should fall on the facility to make sure that the nurse is competent in the area that they will be serving in that facility.
And I don't agree with that. This is Erica, because I've been in experiences right now where it's held to that. And, you know, especially in COVID and the emergency situations we've been in, we can definitely train them and we can provide the basics that are required. But as a consulting firm, I will tell you many facilities don't even do that minimum of here's where you're at. And I just remember when the Senate bill came out that it was supposed to put some onus on the actual staffing agency. And again, they don't uniformly, and some don't even do skills assessments. So you throw a nurse out there and they aren't competent in the skill, in basic skills.
This is Kristen. I would have to agree with Erica and then kind of jump in and expand. I mean, we've had part of paying for a staffing agency or a consultant is you're paying for that skill and that level of expertise, and kind of the idea that you have that expectation that they're coming in knowing a certain level, right? So my expectation, at least from my experience, would be that they would have some core competencies that have already been done by their agency. And then I would partner with them in a collaborative sense. And then, you know, some of the more specified things that I need from that nurse, I would do in kind of not a crash course orientation, but I would still take ownership and be like, hey, these are the things that you need to know specific to this community or location.
Agreed.
So this is Richard again. I'd like to address that issue from our perspective. And, you know, Julie and a couple of others, I think, would echo this. So we've been in this healthcare field since 1998. And we've been Joint Commission certified for a long time. And those requirements they're very stringent on what we do and what we don't do. And when we got into the long-term care field 4 years ago, we took that same level of what we require into that company. And so, you know, I guess from my perspective, we are holding our healthcare workers to a higher standard. And I can't speak for any other temporary staffing agency, but, you know, we do assess their skills and we try to only provide people who meet the standard.
Richard, I would have to tell you that that's honorable for you, but I will tell you, nurses coming from agencies, and I'm not going to point out specific agencies, but many that are, you know, are saying they're not competent in basic skills. They're coming to the facilities saying they're not competent. And I, again, support both sides of the world because we need you and you need us. But I would just hope that you would want your staff to be competent, and a word of competency should not scare the temporary staffing agencies, because it's, again, saying what Ann said, which is that it's just saying you have a policy that acknowledges that you're going to do what, for example, what you're saying or what someone else said, some sort of skills assessments to ensure competency. And all that does is protect you in the situation.
Oh, absolutely. And I 100% agree with that. I'm not taking any exception to that requirement because I firmly believe in that.
Yeah, this is Julie. I agree completely.
Okay.
I like that term in there. I think it holds agencies to a standard that, we should be at in terms of validating and verifying the skill level of any individual placed in any setting that we do. I don't know if it makes sense to say competency through skills assessment. I think the industry standard is we require an 80% skill assessment on any individual that goes into any different setting. So like a long-term care nurse has a different assessment than an ICU nurse, for example. But I agree completely. I like this. I don't have any concern with it. I think we just needed to find what that competency is. And I'd love to see every staffing firm at that level.
100% agree, Julie.
I got hands all over the place. Sarah?
Hello. I was just going to add, I think the question, if I understood correctly, wasn't whether competency should be included, but is there a question of what that means, I think is what we were saying. But how I have seen a similar statement worded in other areas has been specific to that as a criteria of your maintaining this, authorization. You must be able to provide evidence of how you ensure competency and experience and qualifications, so that if the question ever came up, you have to be able to provide that documentation so that they can see what your process is.
Right.
Barbara?
Well, I agree with what has been said, but I also question the method of the competencies and how they are done with staffing organizations. And I think that it's still very important to have proof that it wasn't just a checklist that the staff person filled out themselves, that they're capable of doing that to reduce the risk for the nursing facility or whoever is hiring them.
Sarah?
Oh, sorry. I think you already captured my comment. My hand is just still raised.
Okay, Kristen?
I think something as easy as like when you send the CV for somebody or you approach it, you could send that competency sheet, because what Julie was saying is super true. You're not going to send somebody who is skilled with ICU to an assisted living community. Those skills things are very different. So you could send that skills checklist or what that competency looks like so that there is that supporting documentation so that we can see and be like, hey, this person is suited or they're not suited.
Okay. One of the things I'm capturing as I'm listening, we talked about inexact terms. Okay. 18 years old, very exact. Wildlife, what does that look like? Competency is one of those words, like good standing, that is going to mean very different things for different people in different settings on different days. So what I'm wondering, because this is great conversation, really what it comes down to with rules, again, I'll reiterate, rules are the floor, not the ceiling. These are not best practices. These are the bare minimum that somebody has to do for public safety. So what we try to have in rule are things that people can prove, that people can show us, right? Because if our investigator, if we get a complaint, and I'm just throwing this out there for thoughts, you guys could maybe wordsmith or we can get there together. If we get a complaint and it's based on this person wasn't good for this position, they're not competent, and they file a complaint, what is our investigator going to get to either prove that they were competent or prove that they weren't? Because a skills assessment, maybe, maybe not. So what I ask you is for the floor and thinking about what paperwork, what conversation, what could somebody prove or submit to prove that this person was appropriate for the setting? And would that be captured if somebody called up and said appropriate work experience? Might competency be covered by these skills assessment things or their CV or whatever it is the agency would provide to prove they had appropriate work experience, appropriate training, appropriate background? Would the paperwork that would be submitted in something like that get us to competency without that scary gray word?
Hi, this is Richard again. You know, that's a great concept. Competency is one of those things that can be very subjective.
Absolutely.
And a person can do extremely well on an examination, and yet in their actual performance, it's like, what? Really? So, I like the idea of providing, in the event that there's an issue, of providing, here's how we assessed competency.
Right. And
Now,
that would be
how they actually performed when they showed up on the job, uh, you know, it may or may not be keeping with that. From our perspective, that's been our experience that yes, they test out to be competent. We interview them. They come across as competent. Their background references show that they're competent, but they may show up in a, and for that particular assignment, they're not competent.
right. And some of those details wash out in investigations.
Right.
Sometimes those finer points, again, with rules, we're trying to be specific enough to guide our licensees and make sure that, they understand what's expected of them, but also provide enough goalposts that our investigators, if there is a problem, you don't want it to be so specific that you limit yourself, but you got to put a fence around this somehow. Erica?
And that's where I'm going with the wording, just from, again, both sides of the world, with putting the fence around, because literally I don't think a CV can prove competence, because I could have worked at 17 places and sucked at every single one of them. And I just feel like that's not sufficient enough. So I don't know. I don't know if there's a softer word for competency. It's not a scary word for me, because it's what's asked in the rules that I'm governed by, both as a nurse and in long-term care. So, but I mean, I don't feel saying work experience is enough, because you can have work experience and have been failed from every area.
I agree with that, Erica. Thank you. This is Richard.
Thank you. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
I was just going to comment, if you're looking for additional goalposts or specific items that are maybe more relevant than a general statement like work experience, as was just mentioned, I would say there's a lengthy list, but you're looking at professional references from the people who supervised these clinicians on recent jobs to be able to say clinically how they were able to function and if they truly were competent for the unit they worked on. You're looking at competency exams, not just skills checklists. You're looking at interview debriefs. Did they have the correct skills when they spoke with the manager that hired them for the contract? And you're looking at evaluations from assignments and annual evaluations if they've worked for your agency over time. So I think there's numerous, again, I don't know how specific you want to get, but I think there's several other ways, if you're wanting to be more specific, that you could point out items that you would look at to help support competency.
Is there a standard competency test in your industry?
There is not a standard competency test, but there are very common vendors, if you will, who provide competency testing that is most commonly used, and it is specific to that clinician's profession and what unit they're working on and skill set. Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
That's correct. Correct.
Okay.
There's national companies out there that all of the national staffing firms use. We probably use the same ones in a lot of cases that create.
Companies use those too?
I couldn't speak to that, but when I first started out day one, I used them. So yeah, I think they're pretty standard from my understanding. And they have competency exams for essentially every skill set clinically that you would place in any sort of setting, for the most part, even down to public health nurses that work at a county or any sort of skill set in a hospital versus long-term care settings and so forth.
Sarah?
Yep. I agree. And I would say I've worked for a very large agency and a very small agency, and it is pretty standard across the board. There's, again, a few vendors that tend to be widely used and accepted by clients and MSPs as well.
Okay, well, this phraseology that we have here comes straight out of the bill. Is there something that we can add to this? Would we say, take, because again, this was something that would wash out. You don't have to, we don't want this paperwork, right? Like, you don't want to give this to us. But if an investigation came up, would adding some language around have taken any appropriate examinations, competency examinations, would some language like that help?
I would think so. This is Julie, and I think not only just taken, but also passed with a minimum score of 80%, which is generally industry standard. I don't know if every other agency on here uses that, but I think not only have taken the exam, but also passed the exam. Because
okay, has the appropriate, maybe we can add some language around.
And this is Angie. I think that would go in the records retention portion of the records we would want them to retain in order to prove it. So I think when you're thinking about this is like, how are we gonna, from an investigation standpoint, like, we need to make sure that we can say, like, you need to provide it to us. This is one of the records that you need to retain, and then that's what we're going to request in order to prove the potential violation.
I'll put this down here and then we'll get there and you guys can judge my wordsmithing. Sarah?
My hand is just still up. I'm just liking to keep it raised just for fun, just in case.
We all struggle with the hands up thing, right?
Oh man, it's such a neat little feature, except you have to unraise.
No, it's okay. Hey, and it's okay, as long as you guys are still having fun. All records related to employee, would it be competency testing?
I think that sounds good.
Yeah, I agree.
Look at the stuff we find out. Okay, great. So if we put that down in the bottom and we stuck with, again, we're talking about investigations, what we can prove. What a staffing agency, if there was a complaint about someone's performance. So as long as it fell under this, work experience, training, and background needed, this is what the staffing agency has to do, and then we'll get down into the records. Is everybody doing okay? Let me see how far we have to go. Okay, we're pretty close to the bottom. Would anybody want like a 5-minute break to re-up their coffee, use the restroom? Are we all warriors and we're going to keep going?
I'm good to go.
I'm
good.
Keep going.
You guys are amazing. Okay, well then we soldier on. So we talked about the work experience. Now we get into records. Okay, these are the things that we propose that staffing agencies have to keep for at least 10 years, although we have heard earlier they're kept in perpetuity. Personnel applications. Can we go through this section by section? Does anything stick out for anybody that needs to be added, adjusted? Nothing. Okay. So copies of contracts. Record of fees charged, collected, and refunded to verify the record of fees. And we're adding all records related to employee competency testing. Does that language get us to what our earlier concerns were? Barbara, what do you think?
Yes, I think that that does. Like, with each application that we get from a staffing agency, they usually include all of that, and you have the choice whether or not to deny or accept the members. So I think most staffing agencies are on that right now.
Fantastic. Robert?
I was going to say, the records related to competency testing, you could use the word competency evaluation because there's multiple components that, that you'd put into, and that's just a suggestion, to evaluating their competency. Not only would you have the test, you would have their references, their outcomes, their license status, there's a number of things that you look at to determining a person's competency, if you want to put them out on the floor. And I've done all those things with people, and somebody said earlier that it's very subjective, because I've dotted all I's and crossed T's and put somebody out on the floor and they crash and burn, and everything looked great on paper. So that's really all you have is what you evaluate them on, and you could keep records to that end.
Should I say evaluation singular or plural? Competency evaluations could be anything.
I think singular.
I think you need to include testing in that, because you could just have somebody do a self-assessment and that could be their quote unquote competency, but it's really not. So I think I would recommend we have the word testing in there somewhere.
Yeah, I think it looks good to have both in there.
So competency evaluations and testing, that way that could be anything.
Yep.
Does that get us there? Fantastic. And let's see. This is so precious. I keep trying to save it and my iDrive is not wanting to go there. Okay, so this is fantastic. So everything related to records that you would have to keep, obviously, you keep them forever, we're in good shape. Any other thoughts? Anything that you think an investigation or anything the office might need in case of a complaint might be useful to us to add to this list of things that you have to keep in records?
This is Sarah. The only thing I can think, which I don't know if you would technically qualify this as competency evaluation or testing, but HR documentation, or like in our agency, and I think in some agencies it's referred to like as a review board. So when there's an incident that occurs with an employee, you have your process to review what it was and whether you can work with that person moving forward. I do think it's not uncommon that clinical or competency related things do come up, and you may provide sort of re-education to a candidate depending on the severity of it. And I think that could be important to retain in terms of any investigation as well, to say, was this person still qualified and competent to work?
Well, could we add another one? Or, I mean, because once we start adding so many commas, what about records related to employee performance?
Yeah, or internal or investigation related to employee performance. Because I would agree, this is Erica, that oftentimes those things kind of are in a round file and they aren't always maintained.
What about any sort of discipline?
Yeah.
All records related to employee, what would you call it? Discipline?
Disciplinary action?
Or a lot of times now they use like coaching up to disciplinary action, because it could just be, an information.
Yeah, great point.
Performance. Will that cover it?
Yes.
Okay, so we like performance. Because I mean, hey, if they're a 5-star player, that would be there too. But again, we unfortunately like to say that rules are written for people who don't follow the rules. So, anything else? I mean, this is great stuff, guys. And keep that in your mind, because we've still got some more time before we've got racial equity. Hopefully you're keeping that in your mind. Positive, negative, indeterminate. We've got the fiscal impact, which I know we've had some comments on, and we do have time for public comment starting at in about an hour and a half. So we still have plenty of time to go. And so if you think of something else, we can go back. So discipline and civil penalties. Now, this particular bill, obviously it says here, Bill 1549. When this is codified, when it actually joins our big book of ORSs, these things will be changed to those 6-digit numbers that we talked about earlier. We just don't know what they are yet because we don't have our big book. So for right now, we are going along with what the bill said. which is, and contested cases. That's what I talked about earlier. Anyone who is an authorization holder with us has certain rights. If they are subject to discipline, they have contested case. They can dispute the findings of the investigation, and we can go before an administrative law judge where they bring their facts and we bring ours, and they list findings. If the person, or in this case company, is not happy with the outcome of the ALJ, they can go all the way up to, they can appeal to the Oregon Supreme Court, which we've had cases go that far. Never lost them, but we've had them go that far. So this is what the whole contested case piece is all about. But because, you know, obviously within chapter 183, we can deny a license, we can revoke one, we can suspend one, we can discipline a person. By the way, to let you know, because we don't have a board, which is our built-in subject matter experts, very convenient. If we had a case like this, we might contract with a subject matter expert to look over the components of the case to help us understand what we need to know. But just to let you know kind of how that works. But we have the authority to impose discipline. The way the bill says is we can impose discipline for any violations in sections 2, 4, or 5 of the bill, or any administrative rule or order issued by the office. One of the things we were concerned about is we can impose discipline if somebody provides us bad information, and I don't mean a typo. I mean, this is falsehoods, misrepresents any information on the application. If they fail to ensure that the personnel have the correct professional authorizations or experience, I might refer to that rule that we adjusted up top. You know, we're talking about work experience. Okay. If they don't retain the records that this group has added to, that they're supposed to, if they don't disclose to the office any information, if we ask them to submit something, if we get a complaint, we say we need something, and they say, we have the capacity to impose a civil penalty. If they don't cooperate with an investigation, if they charge a fee in violation of section 5.2 of the bill, if they've been disciplined, and this is the other thing, you know, we talk about fingerprints. One of the things we looked at is what would be in keeping with the spirit of the bill that would force somebody's fingerprints come up. Well, if they got a speeding ticket, does that matter? What matters in the spirit of this authorization and this program? And the things we came up with was dishonesty, misrepresentation, you know, the kind of business crimes per se, or we can discipline them for failing to comply with a final order. If we say, okay, we've done an investigation, these are the findings, you violated X and Y, we went before an administrative law judge because you wanted to and we prevailed, and you say, no, we're not going to pay that. Well, if you owe money, just letting you know, folks who don't do business in Oregon, if you owe money to the state of Oregon, that never goes away. Okay, we can go to the IRS or, you know, the revenue department. They can garnish, they can do lots of things, but it never goes away. I think the only way to get away from it is if you die, and then only maybe. Richard? Do you have a question?
Oh, yes. So on item C under 2C, you know, fails to ensure that personnel have the correct professional authorization or experience.
Yeah.
So totally understand the correct professional authorization and referring to the rule above. So what's the driver behind that? So on the experience part, because it happens occasionally where everybody's been looked at, they've been vetted, they've been interviewed, they've been tested, and they go to work and they don't perform. And somebody says, I don't think they have enough experience, and so somebody files a complaint on they don't have enough experience. So and that's a subjective thing.
Sure.
And I'd hate for us to try to get into, well, let's define what experience actually means.
Oh yeah, we don't want to go there.
Because that could be 32 pages and.
Right. Well, we're really getting at the personnel have the required professional authorization needed to perform. So if we get to have the professional authorization, this kind of refers to that one that was up above where we started doing the competency thing.
Right.
What should we have here? Should we, because you guys are talking about, like, as we've heard before, that somebody could pass every test and check every box and fail their way, the great failure tour across America. What would we want to put here when it comes down to discipline? Like, you've done your part. You've made sure that you've done your part to make sure this person has what they need to go and do the job. But if they go and fail, you did what you needed to do. How do we get to that, Erica?
And I just wanted to clarify, is this not the language right from the bill? I felt like it was, but maybe I just am mixing things up. But maybe we could put some sort of caveat in there that the actual temporary staffing agency wouldn't necessarily be disciplined for the individual professional that did the, that was determined to be found guilty of something. I'm not trying to say guilty, but they were the one that did the issue, but if the investigation determined that the temporary staffing agency did everything, it wouldn't be like a double jeopardy then. It would only be the individual that would be disciplined.
Right. Bob has a comment.
Hi, this is Bob Lothwell, everybody. So if HLO determines that the agency did their due diligence, ensure that the person, if they passed their test with the agency, if they provided information that was vetted and the information was good, so the temporary staffing agency did the due diligence, and an individual is on the floor and violates practice standards, then another entity such as that professional licensing board, i.e. Board of Nursing, Respiratory Therapist, whomever, their statutes would probably take into account or come into play with performance, practice standards or failures or what have you. So if HLO were to determine that the temporary staffing agency did everything they were required to do, and they provided us all the evidence, and the evidence shows that the respondent employee or temporary employee failed in their performance standards, then the other entity, the other licensing board for that individual, HLO would report up to the appropriate licensing board. Not necessarily taking, I'm not saying it's a wash for temporary staffing, but we would vet it, and if it needed to go to the other agency, we would refer it to the other agency. And for us, you would have done everything that you needed to do, and we'd move on from there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Bob, so we have the Board of Nursing, and then we have, for RNs, LPNs, for other disciplines, certified nursing assistants have to be certified and licensed by the state. And in the event that there's failure to perform, it's those entities who actually discipline the individual.
Correct.
That's correct.
It's not us. And so,
Correct.
It seems like it's almost a double measure of discipline and penalties. So,
well, Richard, to speak to your point and to kind of flesh out what Bob said, there's two levels that we're looking at here, right? The temporary staffing agency makes sure that the staff that they're sending out, if they're supposed to be RNs, are RNs, and they are appropriately credentialed. So they are sending them into a job requiring an RN. So at that point, everybody's done what they're supposed to do. Then the RN gets on the floor and commits a violation of practice, some sort of standards of practice of scope. The temporary staffing agency, if there's an investigation, the temporary staffing agency did their part. They checked their boxes. If the person did something on their own that violates their standards of practice as a nurse, then that would be referred to the appropriate nursing board that their license is held under. Does that make sense? So there's two layers here.
Correct.
Making sure that everyone does what they're supposed to do. Now, if you have a case like that, I can't imagine where the person who ended up getting referred to the Board of Nursing, if the staffing agency, if they looked good on paper and they had everything they need to do, and the staffing agency, as Bob said, did due diligence, you should be fine. But that will wash out in an investigation, and it's not like you're going to get penalized twice. Like you're going to have to wear a penalty because they violated something and ended up going to the Board of Nursing. But if they got in trouble with the Board of Nursing and you continued to send them out with active disciplinary or known disciplinary problems, then that might be a problem. You see the difference?
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Everybody. So speaking to your point, Richard, it fails to ensure that the personnel have the correct professional authorization or experience needed. Could we tweak that a little bit and say correct professional authorization or work experience required to perform? Would that get us closer to some specifics? Are we more comfortable with those word choices?
Yeah, they needed and required. Yeah, it's one of those, I'm not really sure which word would be better.
Erica, do you have a thought?
Yeah,
like
my
the
thought
needed.
is that required is actually a tougher word. Could we not just refer up to the prior order rule, which was the 331970005, where it already says that?
We absolutely can.
And we don't have to try as hard.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Erica.
And this is where we get to be all government-y. Okay. So then we can literally point to that rule and say, okay, if you don't meet this standard, in an investigation, we'd look at who did what and what happened. Did you do your part?
Right.
Happy with that?
Yep, that works.
I love the fact that you're so good, you're referring to other rules. That's how good you are. Okay, so again, fails to retain records. That's something that I'm going to put the number in that refers to the records that you guys added to as far as competency goes. Fails to cooperate with investigation, charges a fee in violation 5.2. That talks about, go ahead. I'm sorry, Richard, did you say something?
Well, yeah, so I have a question on item G, charges a fee in violation of section 5, subparagraph 2.
Yep.
And I'm looking at that going, what fee would be charged?
It just says
one would violate.
Well, it just says may charge to an entity that engages and I have to admit, this is not the easiest sentence in the world to understand. Let's just agree with that. But it says may charge a temporary staffing agency authorized under this means you have a license, may charge to an entity that engages the agency, okay, people that hired you, fees or other amounts related to or associated with the subsequent hiring of personnel. This is, from what I understand, and Erica may be able to flesh this out, some organizations, if temporary staffing agencies hire staff away from permanent facilities, they can say, okay, if you take our people, you owe us a fee for training them. I don't want to say headhunting, but kind of that's the word that's been thrown around. Erica?
Yeah, so this is what that was originally trying to point to. But it also is a little bit misleading and leads into another one of the things from the Senate bill that I was questioning, because the Senate bill really clearly states that the temporary service agencies have to provide a annual fee structure to you guys, and I don't see that anywhere in here. And with this being vague, it makes you go, would it be that, or would it be exactly what you're saying, where there's it's not even a fee, they call it, there's like, if I buy this person from you, I have to pay you this, and I can't think of the word. But yeah, it's confusing to know which of the two this is.
Yeah,
Well-
Conversion or buyout.
Thank you. The buyout.
and that's a standard provision in, well, I can only speak for our company and our contracts with our facilities. That, you know, if they hire one of our people before working a certain amount of time, then they owe us a recruitment fee. If we hire one of their people, we owe them a fee.
Right.
Right. And that's where I got confused and where I wondered if this pertained back to the, again, one of the things when the Senate bill came out was about temporary staffing agencies raising rates during emergency crisis situations, and there being a lot of other fees. And so I just didn't see anywhere in this rule that it went back to the Senate bill where it talked about having to provide the fixed costs to you. And I think that was in section 15(2)(a) of the Senate bill.
Well, what's interesting, if you're talking about anything having to do with rate capping, that was all scooped out.
Okay.
All completely scooped out. That is not here now.
And that's why it's not there. So perfect.
Yeah.
So this is just a little confusing then.
No, 100%. And one of the things, like I said, this is not the strongest use of grammar I've ever seen. But if you wanted to know kind of how it related, look at 2A and B, right? It says that you would have to pay an agreed upon fee. Like, you took my people, I took your people. We agree that if that happens, if the teams do a trade during spring training, we agree to pay each other $500 or whatever. And it says, if the entity or the temporary staff directly solicits or attempts to solicit employee of the personnel, so okay, we know we're talking about trading team members, and B, an agreement between the agency and the entity allows each party to charge to or receive, we agree to $500. So that's what that relates to, is player trading.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the other issue is off the table because it is not in the bill anymore.
Got it.
So does that make sense when you're referring to, we're going back to section 5(2) of the Senate bill? So if we agree to $500 and it turns out that I took one of your people and I only want to pay you $300. No, we agreed to $500, and that's what that's about.
Yeah, I think that's clear.
Okay.
That makes sense?
So just one final comment. So you had mentioned that the rate capping has been removed from this,
That is correct.
but it's being reintroduced under House Bill 2556.
2665, I believe it is. And
Yeah, it's 2655.
yes, and but that is not on the table today. That is currently working its way through the legislative process. And as far as this set of rules goes, that is not in the picture.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, eventually, if it does, just to let you know, more Civics 101, if it does, we would have to see what it looks like when it comes out of the pipeline and how these rules might have to point to that. Because that's how rules, how we talked about this pursuant to, now that you can use that word in casual conversation. We pointed to how we pointed up to the other rule. Sometimes rules point to other rules. And if that came out, it would be a question of how these things dovetail together, if any. And then it would be, okay, how do we build the directional signal? But again, that's not on the table today.
Yeah. Okay.
So again, what we tried to stick with is if what's going to cause us to take an action against your authorization? It might be, we really stuck to business fraud, dishonesty, felony or misdemeanor, misrepresentation. Angela?
Sorry, I just wanted to point out when you added in the rule reference for little c, so when you said fails to ensure that personnel have correct professional authorization or experience needed pursuant to that rule, you also need to then add the rule for professional authorization, which is basically the same thing, but 00000, all the zeros.
Thank you, Angela.
And you probably just want to add the word work in front of experience.
Hold on. You're killing me here. Okay.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. 970. I'm an excellent typist, but not when people are watching. Okay, or work experience. Does this get us here?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you, Saint Angela. Okay. So we're down here again. We were talking about when we were looking at this, when you talk about businesses with individuals, depending on the profession, if you've been convicted of identity theft, we really would be hesitant to give you an authorization that would give you access to people's credit cards, right? What do we care about? What would concern us when it comes to companies? So we really stuck with the fraud, misrepresentation piece, because what goes on in your personal life, if you're the owner of a company, what would we have to do with that? So we kept it very simple that way. And the bill was very clear, and that we can impose a civil penalty of $500 per day. Now, HLO has the authorization to do a lot more than that, but the bill was very specific, $500 per day per violation of any of these provisions. So if you send a person out 15 different times and they were not appropriately credentialed, that's going to add up. But that's how the bill set it out. Again, each assignment of an individual personnel member is considered a separate violation. So it's not like you sent one credentialed person out 40 times and you pay $500. No, it's 500 times 40. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Wow, okay. So we are slightly ahead of time, but we're doing really well. Let me save this. So now, if I may, I am going to start taking notes. The two pieces that we have to do according to our agenda, I'll bring that up and cover the screen, is the statement of need and fiscal impact. And I know a lot of you had comments. Prepare those thoughts because I'm going to write them all down. And then we need to talk about the racial equity statements. So we can go ahead and get started unless anybody has anything else they want to add to the rule draft. Anything? Anybody? Okay. Well, then let's go ahead. We're going to get a little bit ahead of ourselves, but let's talk about the statement of need and fiscal impact. Let us have it. I've heard about the cost of licensing. The floor is open. The cost of these regulations. Think about any additional costs on impacts of, units of local government, small business, cost of reporting, office equipment, any and all. Fiscal impact, what these rules will do. Erica.
I think, and again, I'm speaking for both sides, but I think that, places that have multiple sites, they're really going to have to look at whether they can fiscally manage that, and potentially would have to shut down some sites if they could not afford the $2,000 for each thing. So that could impact them. Okay. And then just all the fees for small businesses that are just standalone.
Now, when you say all, okay, number one, well, let's talk about that. Multiple sites, each site, and this is one thing that we talked about with our licensing gurus. Some of them are here now. Each site has to have its own authorization, right? each site. So each site is going to require a separate authorization that requires, work. What would be, knowing that you would have to have one at full price, what would be appropriate for the rest of them, and which one would be the main one that you paid for? If you've got, how would that work?
And I think one thing that I've done in the past when I've had to set up CNA programs, and I had like the mother facility and then all the other sister facilities, you would have on your application for authorization that you were identifying your primary site. And then if you had multiple staff, this I think went back to Richard or Robert's response, that were at both entities, and that could be shown, that then there would be like a tier, because a lot of these places, their owners, their primary managers are the same. So you wouldn't be doing background checks on if you had 3 sites or 6 sites on all of them, because they're the same. But then what they have at their sites are actually the site staff that are different. So maybe there could be a tier that if that was the case, it was just like less. And I'm just throwing out a number of 1,500, but you know what I mean? Just some sort of stair step if your primary people were all the same.
Okay, so, and that brings me to another question. If you have a primary site and sister sites, and think about it from our standpoint, we've issued licenses to individuals. Who would get the main license? Who would get the sister licenses? And who would be authorized to decide that?
Well, so is this license or authorization?
Authorization, yeah.
For individuals?
Well, I'm just
saying. Or is it for the staffing agency?
Oh, no, it's for the staffing agencies. What I'm saying is traditionally we have licensed individuals. So now we're looking at companies, right? So we're trying to understand if we took this primary and sister site, the mothership and the sister sites, who would decide which was the primary? Would that be explained in the application? Like, how can you see conveying that information to us? Would it be like, okay, we're going to have 3 locations. We're going to fill out 1 main application and 2 sister site applications, and that would affect the cost, Julie? Or, sorry, Angela?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Angela.
I just wanted to point out that the initial application should, the applicant should be the entity, so the main entity. And, if HLO wants some legal advice on why that is, we can talk about that later, but that the named applicant, the person that's doing the application, you can have additional people on an application who are interested parties, like the language suggests in the statute, but that we shouldn't be, giving everybody an initial application right or a right. It turns into sort of a logistical nightmare if everyone has a right. So you want to make sure that the applicant and the person that is licensed is the entity. And it's a definition in corporate law that a person is an entity. So whatever the named entity is who the licensee should be.
Okay. And how would that work with the idea of the primary site and sister site?
I think we'd have to look at it from the sense of like you'd have the main licensee, and then maybe you would do, I don't know if HLO has a way to do like with the licensing number, it's like a -2 or something like that. I mean, there's ways we can look at it, or we can assign.
Okay, Tina, we're going to hear from our licensing manager, Tina.
Okay, so due to the application process, say there's 6 sites that you have temporary staffing agencies at. The only way I could see it, each one of those individuals you have to fill out an application for each site, because then if you turn them in all at one time and all those same individuals are the applicants on it, or not the applicants, but the parties involved, We would be able to, and we can talk about this later, Anne and Bob, but we could take all those fingerprints that you send in for one of them and apply them to all 6. I'm just using 6 as a number, but apply those same individuals to all 6 applications. But each application has to be separate.
Okay, so it
Hope
is.
that helps.
So Tina, do you think, and this is something we can talk to leadership, but discuss the idea of like the primary site and the sister site and maybe looking at the different costs. Is that something we could do?
I don't know. I think that's a discussion we can have.
Yeah, we can have it offline. Okay, it's just something. So the fiscal impact, you think the $2,000 for each location, maybe there's some room. Julie?
Yeah, I would suggest if there's a main location and then, silo offices or sister facilities, that those are not at the same cost, a significantly reduced cost. And I also think should be the discretion of the temporary staffing agency to define what is their hub or core location, and then, what are the other facilities. So I think that's easily defined for those of us that have multiple locations. We know maybe our core staff are in one, and then we just do payroll or recruiting out of another. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Okay, Shell?
Yeah, I that helped a little bit, Julie. I only have one location, so what I was trying to understand was if I were to open another location, who would be there? It certainly wouldn't be the owner because I own the company, so it wouldn't be anybody who'd be on any of the paperwork. They'd be using the same software system, and payroll process. So they would be doing some of the work, but I don't really know, and maybe Julie could answer this. What oversight would they need from the state versus from the parent, from the main person, the person running the company?
I think that's a really good question, because if we define a site as a location that's actually booking staff into jobs, to me, that's a site. But if it's a separate location that's running all of your payroll, or, people come in to do their I-9s or whatever it may be, to me, that's not a site. But would it be considered a site because of this and how this is defined, how all this is defined? So as much as I don't want to get too much in the weeds on it, I think we need to determine what that looks like, because to your point, Shell, it's, if you're an owner, I am as well. I can't be in 2 or 3 places at one time, and my core location is going to be doing the staffing functions, and the other locations may not be. They just may be support locations.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I think what I was trying to get at, that only maybe Anne can answer, is what work needs to be done by the licensing entity, or you folks. What work needs to be done for those other facilities? They're not going to file a separate application. There's not going to be that work that needs to be done. So what work would need to be done to oversee, or whatever it is that drives that $2,000 cost?
That's a great question, Shell, because right now, I mean, again, we don't know what we don't know. The bill simply says each location has to have a separate authorization. So what the location looks like and the variations within that, we need to know from you. I mean, what's considered a location in your industry?
The definition of staffing agency, temporary staffing agency, kind of help us with that. It's an entity that operates in the state for the purpose of providing temporary work or personnel providing healthcare services, and so on. So if they're not actually actively moving people in and out of an office, and it's just an office for bookkeeping, I don't think that qualifies. That doesn't fall under the definition.
Well, why would you have a location if you're providing services? Maybe Sarah can help. I'm trying to understand why you would have a location that wouldn't fit with the definition of providing, services. Sarah?
Yeah, I don't know if I can actually answer that question. I have sort of another question, which would be, and if anyone else can speak to, like, do you run into cases where the controlling people of the organization are the same people, and yet you have two locations where the same things are happening? You have people recruiting, placing into contracts, but the controlling, owners are the same. Because if that's true, I think I'm coming back to the question, and I'm sorry, I don't recall who asked it, but I know this isn't the intent of this, but it's sort of hard to understand. What burden does that place on the licensing authority when you've already covered everything for the people who own the organization, whether it's split into two locations or not? What difference does that make for you guys to manage?
Yeah, part of it is in the bill that they say any separate location. And again, we get down into definitions where they didn't, they talk about what a temporary, and this is again why you guys are here. They talk about what a temporary staffing agency is. That's defined. And then they say any separate location has to have a separate authorization. But they don't get down into a location that only does X isn't considered a location. You have to say, okay, this isn't a thing. Well, that's not defined. So what do these different locations look like?
Well, this is Richard. So billing and accounting is all handled separately. They don't do anything with staffing. They don't talk to facility. All they do is they process the payroll.
Now, are they called Joe's account a temporary staffing agency, or are they called like billing? I'm just trying to say, are they also known as your company name? They just perform billing functions?
Well, yeah, obviously they are, but it's separate location who does nothing with, providing people to facilities.
Okay, so if that location, just to kind of, again, we're going back down in the weeds. So if that location is not providing temporary work for personnel providing healthcare services or assistance, activities of daily living, if that location doesn't meet this definition, does it count as a location? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's if you're a business and you provide, I don't know, food services, but you have another location where all your trucks are that deliver it, it's owned by your business, but it's not providing, I'm just kind of wondering where that division is.
Right.
I didn't even know that was a thing, that you guys had separate locations that just did administrative services.
Well, we have separate locations in a couple of different states who have nothing to do with providing healthcare workers in the state of Oregon.
Okay, well, I'm going to take this information back. Again, this is great information. Bring all the things. And this might be something. Now, I'm going to take a short rulemaking tour here back to the beginning of time when we had our training. Remember, this is just advisory. We're going to take your feedback, and then all of this, we'll incorporate what makes sense. We'll incorporate what we can. And then it will go out for public comment. So hopefully obviously you guys are all on our mailing list. And then we can take comment on what we incorporate from the staff and from you guys today. And you can do feedback on that. So this is something that we might have to parse out for the rules going to public comment. But definitely what I'm hearing you say is if you have to get an additional location authorization for places that do not provide temporary workers, but might just provide administrative services, that would be a burden. That would be a negative fiscal impact, correct?
Correct.
Okay, I'm going to capture that. Erica, I see your hand up. I'm not ignoring you. Erica, bring it.
Yes, so I think that's beautiful because originally I brought this up as being the fiscal impact. I will just have to say, and being the devil's advocate and the rules advocate, if we are going to do that, which I'm all for, I do believe that somewhere in the disciplinary action, you would then need to do some sort of disciplinary communication stating something to the effect of, if they have 6 sites, but they're choosing to only do 1, and you find out that the other 5 sites really are meeting the definition, then that could be grounds for disciplinary action or civil penalty.
That's actually, thank you, Erica, for that. I'm trying to think. It says violations of sections 2, 4, or 5.
Yeah.
So 2 is.
And I always assume positive intent, but you, for a rule, have to go. There could be somebody that would try to get around it.
No, absolutely. And it does say that we have the disciplinary authority under section 4, which it says may not operate in the state without an authorization, each separate physical location of a temporary staffing agency. So we do have disciplinary authority over
Perfect.
that. Thank you, Erica. So we're gonna look into that as far as the separate locations and if there's anything we can do as far as licensing and sister sites and all that. We're gonna look into that for you. What other fiscal impact of these rules? Positive, negative, uncertain? Give me all the information because I have to fill out a big form. Sarah?
Hello. So this is not super specific, and I understand that, but I would just say, again, speaking for especially a smaller agency, every time another state adds requirements such as this, it really increases the administrative burden for us. Everyone is doing it a little bit differently, so it's difficult to come up with automated or streamlined ways to gather all the information that's required. And so what that leads to for us is, we're typically doing lower volumes across numerous states. And so we sometimes have to strategically make decisions to shift our focus away from one state if, again, the juice is not worth the squeeze, so to speak, for us to, justify doing a handful of placements in a year or two, even though, those clients could use them. Sometimes it's just not worth it for us to justify the cost and the workload of getting licensed or authorized, as well as maintaining, depending on what all that requires. So that's just something I think we're really, as a small agency, feeling across the board. There seems to be a new one of these every week or two, it feels like. And so that's a large load for a small staff with limited resources. So I think it's worth considering.
I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit longer, sir, because one of the forms that I have to fill out, and I know Shell, you as well, is the impacts on small business.
Yep.
And even if it's positive, negative, indeterminate, if you could flesh that out for me, like what this would do to your business, like what administrative costs, what additional paperwork. I mean, give me all the things.
Yep. So it's, again, I'd like to speak specifically to this, but when I'm looking at the big picture again, there are many of these things happening, not just with Oregon. So when you add all of those up and each one is required, they have their nuances, so they all require something different. It is a significant amount of time that goes into ensuring that we are compliant, doing the reporting, getting the licenses, renewing, the cost involved. It adds head count, unfortunately, or it just diverts our existing resources to spend time on this instead of other places that could help us serve our clients better. So it's a challenge. It's tough. I worked for a large agency before, and there were teams and teams of people to manage all of this. But when you're working in a young, small agency, you're very limited on resources. And it gets to the point where you almost do have to make that hire in order to, stay compliant and do everything that's required to be in good standing.
Okay, so are you talking about licensing in authorizations in general, or some
Yes.
specific component? Is there any specific component in this that, other than the fees, is something that's out of the ordinary for you, out of line?
No.
It's
No,
just
again,
overall.
my statement is a bit more broad, and I will say the more challenging ones are the ones that have very extensive reporting due, on a quarterly basis. That becomes quite a bit to manage as well. So it's a more broad statement, but still think for many of us small guys out there, it's something we're all feeling.
No, it's important. Barbara?
I think her statement is alarming in the sense that it could decrease the amount of agencies that we have available in Oregon. I know that our facility in particular is dependent on agency nurses for our staffing. And if this decreases our choices of selection or the availability of nurses, it could cause problems in rural areas of the ability not to accept patients from hospitals, to cut census and not be able to support the community as we would like to. So that statement of hers did concern me.
Yeah, and Barbara, the only thing I just in response would be, we actually have had scenarios where, I won't name the states, but it just was not a good decision for us to move forward to become licensed in a certain state. We had numerous candidates wanting to work there. We had needs from clients, and we ended up having to basically step away, and those candidates wanted to work with our agency. And so that is unfortunate. That I hope they ended up getting there to give the client the the help they needed. But that's just one more obstacle, to get these hospitals and facilities the help that they need, and to also provide good service to the professionals who they know where they want to be, they know who they want to work with, but it's another obstacle.
Shell?
Julie had her hand up first. Let's let her.
Oh, okay. Julie?
Thanks, Shel.
Thank you, Shell. You're such a gentleman.
That's so nice. Well, in addition to owning my office in Oregon, I actually also work for Express Employment headquarters in Oklahoma. And my job is to identify additional markets across the United States and open additional Express healthcare locations.
Be good.
And I will share with you that, to Sarah's point, this is absolutely something that staffing firms look at before they will open up offices or even potentially renew licenses in a state if it's not financially viable for them. And there's a lot of hoops and obstacles and fees and things like that. We have, just like Sarah mentioned, we have stayed away from certain states that have adopted these and other type of laws that restrict staffing firms. It's very real. And I myself have experienced it and recommended to even my organization not to open up in some states because of it. So that's a very real concern. So I just want to share that.
Shell, you're up.
That was really good, what Julie provided there. I think my question is coming from my corporate background is, and I don't mean to be disrespectful about this, but what's the value of providing the feedback if the law has already been passed?
Well, your role about feedback is not necessarily on the bill, because this is what we've got. But this, I kind of liken this kind of a program to like building a car. And this bill gave us the fact that we had to build a car, identified it as a car, put some stuff in it. And what the administrative rules are going to do is finish building the car, flesh out the things we can, and you, as people who can operate the car, road test these rules. Do they work? I mean, is the license like 90 days? Is that enough time to get, there are things that we have some flex on, some things that we can not just say what happens, but how it happens. The law says what, we can kind of say how to some degree. And so I'm asking, you guys to road test these draft rules. What works, what doesn't work. I mean, we've got what we've got. I mean, we are neutral on legislation. They told us to do this, they named us, and we're doing it. So what we do is we bring you in, Shell, and say, okay, with these draft rules, does this make sense for how you do business? More or less? I mean, there's some things we can work on. There's some things we can't do anything about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the answer makes sense. I guess what I'm trying to sort out is what part can we adjust? I think we all feel like the fees are too high. They're as high as, from what I understand, they're as high as, I pinged my advisor. He told me they're as high as any in the state, in the country.
Yeah, I think Minnesota is like $2,000.
Yeah, and Minnesota is one of the states that's in really bad shape. And so, if we're following a model that's a bad model, that's concerning. But my point is that they passed the law, right? So we're now in this boat, and the question really is, I just really don't want to give feedback on something that we cannot change.
Well, the thing is, I'm here to listen, and, I don't want to give you expectations, like if you say, well, I want this to go away. Well, I can't wave my wand and make it go away, but I'm here to listen. I mean, right now we're doing the fiscal impact. I mean, if you think the fees are too high, if you think the impact on business, X, Y, if you think you're going to, and it's not just a good or bad thing. If you say, okay, to put this into place, I'm going to need to hire 2 full-time staff members. I'm going to need, I don't know, $500 worth of paper. I'm going to need a whole new location. This is what we ask. Like, are these proposed rules going to impact? Is there numbers? Are there things you can tell me? Because again, we don't know this industry. You guys do.
Yeah, and so, but I think we're kind of saying the same thing, but maybe saying it differently, which is that all of those things are true. This is going to cause, as a small company of mine, I am going to probably have to, not probably, I'm going to have to seek additional resources, which will drive up the cost of this.
And what would those be? Can you tell me what those resources would be? Because I have to be very specific on my form.
So I'm going to have to, if I'm going to expand my business, and if I keep my business the same size it is right now, I'll be fine. But I have a very small business that's a growing business. And if I'm going to grow my business, I'll have to add additional resources to make sure that we absolutely abide by these rules. I think we do already, but I'm going to need more resources to double check and triple check and do that work.
And that was that.
I am not going to open a second location. I probably was going to. I'm not going to do it now. I'm going to figure out how to operate out of this one location. So, because if I was to follow my business plan and open a second location, I would have to pay the fee twice.
Okay.
And if I were to open a third
resources, I'm sorry, I didn't want you to lose this point. Are you talking about people? Like how many additional staff members, software? What are you looking at?
Yeah, so there'll be licenses for software if I add additional people, which I would be adding at some point anyway. But I will have to, trying to think of the right way to phrase this.
Just speak your truth, Joe.
Well, you talk about competencies and testing and training, and there are some additional check boxes that I need to absolutely make sure fall into place because of this, right? I'm not saying I was avoiding them before or anything like that, but I will want to be extra diligent about making sure that happens.
Right.
Oh, please continue.
I guess that was somebody must have been moved by that. Anyway, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought.
It's all right. You were saying that you were going to have to, around the competency and testing, that you were going to have to add personnel and get software licenses.
Well, I'll have to.
I'm so sorry, guys. Somebody almost hit me with a car. I didn't know I was unmuted, so I'm sorry.
nothing to do with what you're talking about.
And which person is this? Oh, anyway. I think we had a person who was on Teams and is now in their car. So, okay, Shell, I am so sorry. You're having a hard time with this. So you were saying software, additional personnel?
Yeah, Phil, just to get all of this into place the first time, because we're so small, I will either have to work a lot of additional hours or bring in somebody to help me do some of the things I normally do so that I can do this, because this is going to take me some time and energy. And to maintain it will drive a little bit more diligence and time and energy, which will mean that I'll have to put more staff onto the team probably just to maintain the same business that we have.
Okay, so you're talking about additional costs in all these areas, but right now they would be indeterminate. Is that correct?
Well, I will figure them out as we go. Yeah.
but for right now, I mean, it's not like, we have some racks where people are like, listen, I'm going to have to get 3 classes in CE, which I figured out is going to cost me between $500 and $1,000. We don't have a figure on this yet, right? I mean, this is just additional but indeterminate would be accurate, correct?
I would think so. Yeah. I mean, other than the fee, right, which is around $2,500, which I know.
Okay. Richard?
So I know there's lots of conversation, and there'll be even more conversation about House Bill 2665. But so looking at this one with the additional costs, and we're a small agency also, even though we've been around a long time. So as I look through all this, all the different requirements, we'll need to add additional staff member, and that's around $3,500 a month to manage it. Whenever costs on a provider side go up, then what those costs entail is we either reduce staff or we end up having to, in some form or fashion, pass some of those costs on to the client. And, it's a difficult time right now to be contemplating, well, that means bill rate increases, or that means reducing staff. And so the options are limited when we look at, another $2,500 plus $50 per person for fingerprinting. Those things all add up. And so, small businesses don't have this huge pool of money that we can go to and go, oh, no problem, we'll just cover all this and everything will be fine. So in terms of fiscal impact, it would impact us as a small business. It could very possibly impact our client base in terms of, where do we go to cover this cost, which ostensibly is to help the ultimate recipient of the personnel that we send. And those are all kind of dicey situations in today's environment, but those are the realities of the legislature passing on highly significant costs. And I understand that, the health licensing area wants to have the staffing agencies cover their costs without going into the general fund. I totally understand all that, but there are these other factors that impact us as a small business.
Oh,
so
sure.
I just thought I'd pass that on.
Oh, all the things. Shell?
Yeah, and I think as it also I want to kind of talk a little bit about what Julie talked about, which is that for me, as soon as this measure passed and I read it, I began looking at, okay, now my business expansion model needs to change. And so is it going to cost me more money? Likely it's going to cost the people in Oregon more resources, because I'm not going to focus on growing my business in Oregon if I can grow it in other states where I do not have to do all of this. right? I can expand, I can grow, and I'm not going to have to, I can open an office in Idaho or Montana or Wyoming or even Washington, and the licensure will cost me a lot less money, though the procedures may be tougher in Washington. But it's going to, it has a ripple effect, I think, and I know this from studying Minnesota, that Minnesota now has a huge problem where there's a massive shortage that's growing in the long-term care sector because the agencies can't make the money that they want. They also have rate cap, but they can't make the money that they want. And the workers, the nurses, know that they can go to Wisconsin and be paid more money. And they know that they can operate in Wisconsin. I mean, it's got, we're talking about the measure here in big terms, and I like I said, I'm not sure what can be done about that. So I would love for us to be able to figure out anything we can that would streamline this so that it doesn't drive more people out of the system in Oregon.
Sure.
And Shell and Ann, I don't have a way to raise my hand. This is Erica from being on the phone, but I would just echo that because like I said before, I was talking on, I support both sides, but for a fiscal impact, it will impact the long-term care and community-based facilities, small businesses, and I've already seen it happen with the pandemic, where some of the smaller standalone facilities that can't incur these costs of the rising agencies have had to close. So I think we should represent both sides in the fiscal impact.
Okay.
While I still know to have the administrative fees, obviously.
Okay, so I'm trying to separate the big picture, just the idea of 1549 with the rules, because that's kind of what I need to fill out forms on, other than obviously the fees. Is there any other part of this that is going to increase business administrative costs, people? I mean, obviously we've heard that, you might have to get more people if you want to expand, but just to cover the nut here, do you need more people, Richard?
Well, to cover some of the administrative part, we're probably looking at an additional staff member. It could be part-time, but.
And I would agree to oversee making sure background checks are done, making sure the authorization reports are being done so that they aren't having expired authorizations and all of that.
Okay, so making sure that the staff. Go ahead.
And the places that, and I'm just going to be real, we're doing the competencies and things that we're now saying, they would have to potentially add that kind of HR/administrative role to ensure everything in this rule is going to happen timely.
Right. Okay. Barbara?
I feel that, one, they should be given more time to get all of the needed information in. So maybe the 90 days is not going to be enough time, since, they're shorthanded or would need to have other people come on board. And July is just around the corner. I also feel that any costs that they incur, they're going to pass directly on to the long-term care facilities. We already pay an enormous amount to agency staff. I mean, my bill this month is $140,000 for licensed nurses. So this is no small bill that we're looking at. And I think that we need to just consider that we need to make this user-friendly for our staffing organizations so that they can continue to provide care due to the reimbursement rate of the state of Oregon for skilled nursing. And I mean, it waterfalls into everything. This is such a big pool that this is one drop in that pool, but there are so many others that this will affect.
Okay, so when you say, Barbara, making these things user-friendly, the 90 days was referencing once you put an application in, it has to be completed within 90 days. Like, because we have people send in one piece of paperwork and then another piece of paperwork, And we have paper, applications sitting around for a year or 2 years, just incomplete. So that's what the 90 days was for. The renewal, we have a 60-day thing. Make sure you get your fingerprints in 60 days ahead so that you don't get tripped up by your renewal date.
Would it be necessary for all those fingerprints to be done? I mean, is it necessary that all of those people?
It's in the bill. And again, we're neutral. We didn't have anything to do with this, but that's what it says in the bill.
Right.
And fingerprints cost the office $50 a piece to have them run. So, again, it goes downhill. So, fiscal, is there any other piece of the fiscal that we talked about? Because we've got to do our racial equity statement. Oh, Bob has a question. I'm sorry.
It's off topic, and it's probably a guess on this group's part, but does anybody have any idea how many temporary staffing agencies operate in Oregon?
Whoever gave you that price at $2,000 knows exactly how many.
Well, so I can speak to that because my staff and I did research through Secretary of State to attempt to determine how many there are. And the number we came up with was not very high, thus the expense. So if it's a greater number, then or can someone tell us where to look for better answers?
Well, this is Richard again. I'm sorry.
Hold on, Erica. What, Richard?
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, and I'll just be totally frank here, express my opinion. You can take it or leave it. I would much rather sit down with our client base and negotiate a lower rate with them than I would to pay the fee to the state of Oregon. And we understand it's the law. We totally get that, but that's where I'm coming from because I think that would have a greater impact on the whole thing than this particular program. That's just my honest feeling.
Erica, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I couldn't hear everything Bob was saying, but I think what he was saying is that he got a pretty small return number of agencies, which is where the pricing came from. Was that what was said?
Yeah, what we did, one of the things we struggle with, and I mentioned this, when the earth was new and we started out, part of how we price things is take the number of potential applicants, usually it's the people who want to get licensed, and the services that they're going to require us to administer. We have professions that we've had to create exams, practical exams, facility inspections. We have to come up with competency. We have a board to support. Boards are more expensive than programs. And we do the math, we divide it out, we look at the number of staff and staff time that it's going to take look at the number of documents that this bill is requiring. So we do all of those calculations and we put it out there. And if it turns out to be too high and the program is self-sustaining, we're in a position to offer discounts. But raising fees is a whole other
difficult.
kettle of fish.
You got to change the bill. Yeah.
Well, it's not just changing the bill. We have to go to the legislature and do a different process. But
Right. I do think that there is a bigger number of agencies, but it's a very secretive thing. And I'm not saying this to be bad. Again, this came out of the pandemic. It came out of the crisis staffing, where in order to get crisis staffing, you were given a list of like 300 agencies, and about 50% of them, many of us had never even heard of. So I think that there's a lot of staffing agencies that aren't necessarily popping up in the regular sectors. And again, some of this is kind of where this whole bill came into place, is they aren't necessarily following all of these things, which is what's requiring the oversight of the licensing department. So I wonder if there's a way, and I don't know that I have that list any longer, but that we could access that, because then you may be able to get a lot more licensor authorizations that could potentially reduce the overall fee. And I'm just throwing that out there.
No, Erica, and we appreciate it. I have literally, myself and another member of the staff have been running this track now for over a year. And the problem is, if they're secretive, how do you find them? And how do you know?
I know, it's like I was.
Yeah, it's you know, it's hunting smoke. And who's to say if you did find them, if they were even going to come here? And that's the problem.
Right.
We're basing real things and real costs and direct expenses based on what ifs. And it's very difficult. Tina, what
I
would
think
you
it's
say?
the best starting point. Yeah.
Yeah. Tina?
She mentioned a list of 300. Where did that list come from?
Yeah, that's what our staff member came up with too. But to confirm the ones that are above board, we came up with what, 150?
Oh no, it's higher than that.
Higher than that?
Yeah. There's so many that go by names that.
Yeah, we don't know what we don't know, and because they're not in Oregon, we don't know if they're going to come here. So these lists, we're basing real costs based on magical thinking, and that's where the difficulty has been. So after all that, we still have to get to the racial equity statement because we have public comment starting in less than 15 minutes. So pursuant to what we talked about before, 2993 and some of our racial equity pieces, we have to do a statement when we file rules on the potential positive, negative, or indeterminate on racial equity. How will these rules either help close the racial equity gap or thinking about communities of color? How do you think that these could impact the staffing agency licensing? What have you got?
I can't raise my hand, but this is Erica.
Oh, Erica, no, it's okay.
I think that it can have an indeterminate factor based on just racial equity, and I would broaden that even farther in just equity in general in a lot of rural areas, just based off of if we have staffing agencies that are no longer able to function in this capacity, it impacts the racial impact of not only the community that agency served, but also the racial or ethnic group. If those particular groups can no longer work for that agency, and they may need to due to financial issues, or if they can no longer serve their community that they are connected to racially.
Okay, so let me clarify. You're saying that if these rules, if you have staffing agencies that can't work in Oregon, that their employees and the communities they serve, I'm trying to flesh this out a little bit.
Yeah, that their employees that may be of this particular racial ethnicity may no longer be able to serve that particular racial class or serve their own internal racial entity by not being able to work for these agencies any longer, if this rule impacts that.
Okay. Okay. Are there and I've never gotten this information, and you guys can tell me this, are the employees of these temporary staffing agencies and the people who work in your administrative functions, do they tend to be a racially diverse group? do you have what higher normal, if you look at the communities and the percentages of race and ethnicity, do your agencies tend to employ a disparate amount of people of color? Erica, is that you?
So I'm from the facility side. However, I do see a higher group of staff of color and other, like actually even coming from other countries from our agency staff than I do actually the staff that are employed at the facilities, in the facilities I work for. Now, that's not the case everywhere.
No, that's great information, Julie.
Yeah, I would agree with Erica's point. It's not scientific, but in a recent study we did for a bid we were working on, we identified that between 55 and 60% of our workforce were individuals with people of color. So yes.
Okay, so these rules, are you thinking that now, I mean, the bill's aside, right? The bill's the foundation of the house. We're working on the house. Will these rules help you hire more people of color? Is it going to make you, I'm just trying to think about your world. How does this all work together? While you're thinking, Richard?
Well, I think I agree with Julie, and our demographic of healthcare workers is pretty similar. It's 60%. I'll just use the term non-white, 40% white. I don't know that the rules themselves or the bill itself would affect that very much, other than, well, I don't think it would affect it very much. So for me, it would be the racial equity part would probably be indeterminate at this point. But for a company who may be considering doing more work in the state of Washington than in the state of Oregon, that would have an impact.
Okay, so if you decide to funnel workers toward Washington instead of Oregon, would that negatively affect, would that be a negative impact for racial equity in Oregon, or?
Well, that's the part that's indeterminate.
Okay.
Because, I think it's indeterminate.
Indeterminate. Okay. Great. So I know this is really tough, but also think about communities that traditionally don't get a seat at the table. Indigenous communities, or also think about, gender identity, LGBTQ, any of those communities, because I know some of you were selected because you were advocates, or you could speak on behalf of those communities or speak to their struggles in relation to these rules in this world that we're exploring today. Any thoughts on those issues?
This is Erica again, and going from that perspective, and even going back to just the racial equity, but even from the LGBTQ population, I would have to be a little different than Richard in the response, because, for example, if you are based out of Oregon and you work for a temporary staffing agency and when I say based, you live and your family lives in Oregon, and you work for a temporary staffing agency, which you could get your full livelihood and plus from working in your own state, and that agency chooses to no longer serve Oregon, it will greatly impact those different areas, because they now have to determine if they're going to uproot themselves and their family from their community to go to another state if it's too far away, or if there's not enough hours to serve the clientele in Vancouver, and more of their bases are in Seattle or Everett or those areas. So it would impact them.
Okay, so just so that I'm capturing what you're saying if you have a person who lives in Oregon and they work for a temporary staffing agency, and the company that they're employed with decides to maybe focus their efforts in Idaho or Washington, They have to decide to either relocate or find another agency or some other work to do. So that
Correct.
could definitely
And when you say Idaho and particular parts of Idaho, there are particular areas there that if you are from the LGBT community, you would not choose to go and work at or to go and live at.
Okay, so that might have a real impact. So there's areas of the country that for those communities, it wouldn't be an optimal choice.
Well,
it would
the
not
other,
be inviting to work or live in.
Okay.
yeah, the other area too would be in the temporary staffing world, unless you're doing travel on a nationwide basis, the majority of people, and that kind of limited just to the long-term care field, if they're working part-time or even full-time through an agency, and that agency were to no longer be in the state, none of them would be able to travel to a different state to work. It just isn't economically feasible. So, like Eric said, there is that impact.
Okay.
Well, and the licensing to be licensed in another state to work as a healthcare worker is
Correct.
an additional cost and timely as well.
Correct.
That's what I'm talking about. So if you have to go to another state, you have to then incur, if you're going to stay with that company, you have to incur all the costs of being credentialed in that state.
You got it. Yep.
Okay.
And just to be clear, we're not planning on moving out of Oregon.
No, we're not coming for you, Richard.
Okay. Good.
I'm just trying to understand your world. I mean, and that's why I love these racks, because I mean, I've come to racks with just a bill and found out that based on how the bill was written, nobody would qualify for a license. But we don't know that until you guys get in our rules and test drive them. So that's why, again, I'm so grateful that you're here, because you have to tell me. I mean, we have the statute, but we don't. What do they say? The map is not the territory. Well, you guys are the guides to the territory. So that's really great. So what else has this conversation? We've got 9 more minutes before we have to go to public comment. What other things have bubbled up as you've had these conversations about racial, gender equity, fiscal impact? Anything? Okay. If we're ready to leave that, you've got 8 minutes. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you would like to get on the record? Because now's your time. I mean, you'll have additional public comment time, and hey, if you want to come hang out with me at the hearing, you can do that too. But what else haven't we talked about that you want to express? Barbara, we haven't heard from you in a while. Sarah?
No, I think we've covered a lot. This is Barbara. I think.
Agree. This is Sarah.
Okay. Robert, I haven't heard from you in a while.
This is Bob with FlexForce. I think it's all been said quite nicely. I'm just listening in right at the moment.
Okay. Julie, any closing thoughts? And you're all welcome to stay on the line. We're going to have public comment. I have somebody that I believe wants to comment from OCA, but you have 7 more minutes. Julie, Shell, anybody?
Nothing from me. I don't know if there's a way to weave it in or make note of it, but I do think that the financial impact for the staffing firms that are Joint Commission certified and paying thousands of dollars to do that, which we're required to do to, place our nurses essentially in the hospitals. I think it should be, if possible, noted somewhere that there's already such a significant financial impact that we're paying to do that. And, this is just another cost on top of that. So for what it's worth, I just want to say it again.
Let me explore that. Joint Commission certified. Is that a national credential or a state credential?
It's a nationally governed body, I guess is the best way to put it, but each individual firm has to go through biannual significant credentialing reviews.
And what does that cost?
I believe it's about 3,000 initially, roughly 3,000 to 3,500, and about 2,000 every renewal. And then the intercycle, which is in between that 2 years, there is also a fee, but I don't know what that fee is off the top of my head. So it's thousands.
Yeah, Julie, it's around $2,800.
Okay.
Okay. So
We
when
just paid ours.
Joint Commission certified, what do they check?
Everything.
Everything.
It's,
Better to ask what they don't check.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
Okay, so, and this is if you're going to send staff into hospitals.
Yes.
What about long-term care? Do you need to be joint certified?
You don't unless the facility requires it. I don't believe we have any in Oregon that require it that I know of, but
Yeah.
not that I know
The only
of.
other
Maybe
thing
there
is hospice agencies that are JACO often.
Okay, so do you think, and I mean, we can explore this, if a staffing agency can prove that it's Joint Commission certified, they could pay a different rate?
I think so, because it's regulating the same thing essentially.
yes, I would.
And this
I'd
is
vote for
Erica.
that too.
I would agree. Unless there's I don't know that, are you guys required to do the fingerprinting process?
Not through Joint Commission, no.
You don't have to
Yeah,
do
so I think we could reduce the larger fee, but that the fingerprinting and all of those would still have to be. So maybe it would be like a discounted fee based off of similarly to where we said the parent and sister.
Okay, so if you're JACO certified, what do you think? 1,500? Give me a number.
500?
Yeah.
Give me a
I'd go
range.
with
I'd say
1,000.
500.
I would go, I mean, we're splitting it in half, if you do 1,000.
So you're thinking, I heard 500. What else did I hear? 1,000?
1,000.
Okay. Well, that's something that
Well, obviously, this is Richard. I'd vote for 500, but you know.
Okay. 500, well, I'll say I've heard 500 to 1,000, and we will look into Joint Commission certified agencies. And would that be easy for you guys to prove to our licensing staff that you are? You have a certificate, you have some kind of
Yes.
license with a number on it, expiration date?
Yep.
And those are good
Yes.
for 2 years?
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Great
2
information.
years.
Okay. So we're going to look into Joint Commission certification. I don't know if I can do anything, but it's certainly great information. Does anybody else have anything to add before I open the phone?
I just wanted to say thank you for everybody. This could have been a very tumultuous rack, and I was having a little bit of anxiety about it just because, you know, there are people that are working on both sides, but I think it's been awesome because we're all in support of each other to do what we're all here for, and that's actually care for the people we're serving.
Oh, and I totally concur. And one of the reasons that all of you were selected was the perspective that you brought, the diversity. You know, this isn't our first rodeo. I mean, we've done a lot of programs. This is our first business, and you kind of get a feel for like the A players, the collaborative folks, and all of you definitely stood out. And I'll repeat myself. I'm incredibly grateful for your time. It's immensely valuable to everyone. So if you want to hang on and listen, I'm going to see if there's anybody on the phone that wants to make a comment. Okay. Hi, this is Ann Thompson at the Health Licensing Office. Is there anybody on the phone?
Hi, Ann. This is Eugenia with Oregon Healthcare Association.
Hi, Eugenia. Well, as far as I know of, you're the only one on, unless there's somebody else there. You have the floor. Would you like to make a comment at this time? And if we don't have anybody else, let me hold on one second. Eugenia, is there anybody else besides Eugenia on the phone?
This is Erica. I'm going to stay on.
Oh, okay. No problem. I'm talking about on the public phone, but thank you so much, Erica. So we only have one person who would like to make a public comment. So Erica, while I we really can't do the full 30 minutes, you are not held to the 2-minute time limit.
I appreciate that.
So proceed.
Thank you so much. As I noted, my name is Eugenia Liu, and I am with the Oregon Healthcare Association. We represent over 90% of the licensed long-term care providers here in the state of Oregon, which includes nursing facilities, assisted living facilities, residential care facilities, and memory care endorsed units. I did want to share a couple of things and a couple of perspectives around some of the topics that were raised today. First and foremost, I think the intent of Senate Bill 1549 was to promote accountability and oversight, as well as quality of temporary staffing agencies. What we were really trying, I think the bill really tries to achieve, is to make sure that there's a reduction in practices that many providers saw involving poor quality care from individuals who were with staffing agencies. So one of the things that I think you guys mentioned is, who needs to be identified in an application. There were some questions around, ownership, partnership, or something with a similar interest in the applicant. The intent of that was to ensure that an owner was not perhaps someone who was on the list of excluded providers. So if you look at, an owner, it could be a direct or indirect type of ownership interest. Perhaps it's a trust. Perhaps it's some other type of financial interest, but really, truly, it was aimed at ensuring that bad actors did not own and operate a temporary staffing agency here in Oregon, or that operated here in Oregon. So it wasn't necessarily, shareholders, but definitely taking a look at who within the organization was able to direct perhaps the organization, someone who had an ownership, again, whether it was a direct or indirect ownership, a partnership in that, or some other tie that, again, we would be able to determine this person on the list of excluded providers and shouldn't be operating here in Oregon, or has engaged in other type of conduct that, again, disqualifies them from operating here in Oregon. In terms of the records that would be retained, I think I heard some very good comments around the types of records that should be retained and made available to the health licensing office. I think on top of personnel records, disciplinary records, some of the core things that you would want to find and retain for the purposes of investigation, for the purposes of verifying compliance with the rules, would include, for example, training requirements, any type of background checks that have been completed on the individuals who are providing services. Again, perhaps complaints, investigation of complaints involving that individual. And again, this is to ensure and promote quality of the personnel that are going into buildings and providing services on a temporary basis. I also heard a little bit about some comments around competency. I think the intent, again, was to ensure that individuals who are being assigned to a building are qualified for that position. I don't know necessarily if there was any intent behind the bill to require a competency test or for someone to pass a test. However, certainly what I think the bill attempted to achieve was to address some situations that were being raised. For instance, an agency may be sending someone who does not have any experience with dementia care into a memory care endorsed unit and not being able to provide the services that the residents within that memory care building needed. It perhaps was sending someone into a vent unit, again, without that experience of being able to provide care to a vent unit or a vent patient. So I think it was less about a competency exam with a pass rate, but more around whether or not that individual who's being assigned to that particular setting was qualified and had the skills, experience, knowledge, and work experience, more importantly, to provide care for that particular unit or for that particular setting. And I think some of the regulatory oversight and licensing pieces that can be incorporated and perhaps fleshed out by the committee would be, for example, I think the goal was, again, to promote accountability and promote quality. Things that would achieve that would perhaps include in your licensing and regulatory requirements, some mechanism or some rule that ensured temporary staffing agencies took steps to ensure the personnel that were being assigned had the professional qualifications, license and certifications, and or authorizations for that position. So again, to the point of if it's an RN position, that the person that's being assigned has a current valid RN license, or if the person that's being assigned to the setting is going to be working as a certified nurse.
Did she go away?
I'm not hearing anything.
I lost her.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. She was talking about making sure that the people who are sent out to units are appropriately credentialed.
And I think that they meet the training and continuing education requirements. I think there are positions, for instance, and this goes back to having qualified individuals, that, for instance, individuals are completing the training that's required to identify, report abuse and neglect, that they're getting trained and complete their CEUs. And again, this goes back to holding the same qualifications and training requirements that are needed of the permanent staff position that they're filling in for. And I want to make sure, can you still hear me, Ann?
Yes, yes, you're doing well. Anything else?
Okay. The other thing that I think came up that I wanted to address was there were some questions around the fees that could be charged by an entity. That was actually, I think the intent of the bill was to address, you guys are correct, buyout fees and conversion fees or recruitment fees. What I think many providers had voiced were concerns that they were being asked to pay exorbitant fees when a agency staff member, for instance, voluntarily chose to work within a building. So this is not a situation where there's direct, it's not a situation where there's direct solicitation or anything of that nature, but perhaps an agency staff heard about an open position, saw an ad about an open position at one of the buildings that they were temporarily assigned to, and they wanted and chose to apply for that position and take that position. What we were hearing is that a lot of times temporary agencies were charging very, very high conversion fees or buyout fees, even though it was a situation where there was direct solicitation of that personnel. So the language is really, of the bill was really intended to address that type of situation. We had also heard from providers that these conversion fees were one-sided. So for example, the agency could charge a conversion fee, but the providers could not charge that same conversion fee if the agency went into a building and tried to recruit or take one of their staff. So the intent of that provision was really to make any types of fees mutual and to only allow them in situations where there is some type of direct solicitation or attempt to solicit, and allow workers to kind of flow between different places on a voluntary basis, again, where they're not being solicited and where there's no attempt at solicitation. And again, to make those fees mutual. And then I think the other piece, I think there were some comments around the types of disciplinary actions that could be taken against a temporary staffing agency. I think this goes back to being able to hold agencies accountable, ensuring quality of the staff that are being assigned, and providing that level of oversight. If they're not complying with the rules or complying with the statute, or perhaps sending in people who are not qualified time and time again, or if their personnel are coming into a building and engaging in abuse and neglect, or misappropriating resident or client, or patient funds, if they are presenting or engaging in acts or behaviors that present a threat to the health, safety, or welfare of individuals in the building or other staff members, permanent staff members in the building, or if they don't meet those qualifications, those would all be types of situations where that regulatory oversight, I think, is important and needed to ensure, again, that temporary staff are meeting the same qualifications and providing that same quality of care to residents or patients in a building or hospital.
Thank you, Eugenia. Was that everything?
I think that's all I had. I'm happy to answer any additional questions or to provide additional comments.
Oh, no, it's no problem. I mean, again, this is public comment. It's not a dialogue, but thank you. You covered a lot of stuff. So RAC members, are we good to maybe cut out a few minutes early? Get back to your busy lives?
Yeah, this is Richard. I think so.
Okay.
Yes, this is Erica.
Thank you, Erica. Well, unless anyone has any comments or concerns, and again, these draft rules we're gonna give them another go through. We're gonna make whatever adjustments we can based on the information you provided, and they will go out. We anticipate, unless there's a problem, that they're gonna go out for public comment at the beginning of April 1st. You'll get notifications since all of you are on our interested party list. And there will be a rule hearing at the end of the month. If you'd like to call in and talk to me some more, that's great. And again, a lot can happen between now, but we are expecting and we are hopeful that these will go into place on June 1st. So if there's no other questions, I will bid you all goodbye and thank you again.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.